You know how it goes. You move to a new neighborhood, hoping for peace and quiet, a fresh start. Just you, your car, and the calm of suburban life. But in that brief moment of settling in, you realize that peace is a fleeting illusion. Mason had barely unpacked when it happened. The knock on the door. Sharp, insistent. He opened it to find a woman standing there, her posture rigid, her expression cold, a clipboard clutched in her hands like a shield. "I'm Karen," she announced, as if that were all she needed to say. "And I'm the president of this community." Mason blinked, still groggy from the move, barely registering her words. But then came the punchline. "That car in your driveway," Karen sneered, "is unsightly. It doesn't belong here." Mason glanced at his car, an unremarkable black sedan, and wondered if she was joking. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't old. Just a normal car, in a perfectly normal driveway. But to Karen, it was an offense. "You're going to need to remove it," she declared, her tone final. At first, Mason thought it was some sort of prank. But then the notices began. The passive-aggressive emails, the phone calls. Every day, Karen made it her mission to remind him that his car, his choice was disrupting her vision for the neighborhood. What Karen didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that this wasn't just any ordinary dispute. This wasn't a battle over HOA rules. No, Mason wasn't just another homeowner. He worked for the CIA, and that car, it wasn't unsightly. It was government property, equipped with technology so advanced it could withstand anything from high-speed chases to explosive attacks. And when Karen decided to take matters into her own hands, she had no idea what she was about to unleash. Mason had hoped it was a one-off incident, a brief encounter with a woman who simply took her HOA duties a little too seriously. But Karen had other plans. The next morning, as Mason grabbed his coffee and stepped out onto the porch, he found a thick envelope wedged under his door. He opened it to find a violation notice, detailing how his car was an eyesore and how he was required to remove it within 24 hours. There was no explanation, no real reason, just a demand, a threat. He rolled his eyes, muttering to himself, "What next? Is she going to send me a letter about the clouds?" But this wasn't just any normal neighborhood complaint. Karen wasn't backing down. Every time Mason went outside, she'd be there lurking nearby, watching his car as if it were a crime scene. He'd wave at her, but she'd always just glare back with that smug, "I'm in charge" look. A week later, Mason came home to find another notice on his windshield, this time with an ultimatum. If the car is not removed within the next 48 hours, towing will be initiated. There was no attempt at diplomacy, no discussion, just an ironclad, one-way demand. "Seriously?" Mason muttered under his breath, his hand tightening around the notice. "What is she trying to do? Get me kicked out of the neighborhood over a damn car?" He thought about calling her, but instead, he decided to walk over to her house. Maybe, just maybe, they could talk this through. He knocked firmly on her door, trying to remain calm. The door opened, and there stood Karen, smiling in that too cordial way that immediately set off Mason's internal alarm bells. "Mason," she greeted him with exaggerated cheer. "I was just thinking we should talk. Come on in." But Mason wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He straightened up, his jaw tightening. "I've had enough of these violation notices, Karen," he said, cutting right to the point. "Why are you coming after me over a car?" Karen tilted her head, the smile never faltering. "It's not just the car, Mason. It's about maintaining the aesthetic of our neighborhood. We have standards here." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetic? You're telling me a perfectly normal car doesn't fit in?" "Well, it's a bit of an eyesore," Karen said, her voice softening as if she were explaining something obvious. "We have a beautiful neighborhood, Mason. I know you're new here, but we take pride in keeping things looking nice." Mason couldn't help but chuckle. "You're kidding, right? This neighborhood's got nothing going for it besides a few well-manicured lawns and a bunch of angry residents." Her expression faltered for a split second. "This is about community, Mason. If you don't respect the rules, how can we ever have a harmonious living space?" "That's rich," Mason shot back, "especially coming from someone who sends threats over a car like that's the biggest problem in the world. What's next? Are you going to start measuring the length of my grass?" Karen narrowed her eyes, her voice lowering. "I'll have you know, I'm simply trying to protect the integrity of this neighborhood. If you don't respect the rules, things can get unpleasant." people start complaining. Look, I don't care about your HOA rules, Mason said firmly, his patience thinning. I've lived in worse places. This car isn't the problem. You are. Karen stiffened. If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to enforce the next step. And what's that? Mason asked, his eyes narrowing. Karen reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. You're already on your second warning. Next comes a fine, and after that I'll be forced to call in a tow truck. I'm not letting this go. Mason took a deep breath, looking at the papers in her hand. Do your worst. But I promise you, you won't like what happens next. He turned and walked back to his car, feeling a strange sense of calm washing over him. Karen was a lot of things. Annoying, petty, self-important, but she was no match for what he was about to unleash, and she had no idea what she was messing with. The next morning, as Mason sipped his coffee, he heard the unmistakable sound of a truck revving outside. He looked out the window, and there it was, a tow truck, backing into his driveway with the driver already preparing to hook his car up. Mason's blood ran cold. Without thinking, he rushed out the door, the cool morning air hitting him sharply. Whoa, 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 he shouted as he sprinted toward the truck. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen was standing triumphantly near the tow truck, arms crossed, as if she had won some kind of battle. Your car is coming with me, Mason. You were warned, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Mason's heart pounded in his chest. This is a huge mistake. You don't know what you're doing. Stop! But it was too late. The tow truck's winch began to pull, and that's when the car's alarm system triggered. The sound was deafening, shrill, sending birds scattering from trees and causing everyone in the neighborhood to step outside in confusion. The truck shuddered, its tires skidding against the pavement as if it had suddenly become far heavier than expected. The driver fumbled with the controls, cursing under his breath. Lady, he said, looking at Karen with sudden concern, I don't think this is a normal car. Karen's smugness began to crack, but she wasn't backing down. Just tow it already. But then the sound of screeching tires tore through the air. Two black SUVs appeared at the corner, moving fast and deliberate. They pulled up beside the tow truck with a force that could only signal one thing. This was no ordinary tow. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously, and two men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions stone-cold serious. One of them approached the scene, pulled out a badge, and held it up with a quiet authority that made everyone freeze. That vehicle, the agent said, his voice commanding, is government property. Step away. Karen's face went pale. What is this? She stammered. The agent ignored her, turning to the tow truck driver. Unhook the car. Now. The driver didn't waste a second. He scrambled to release the hook as fast as he could, his hands shaking. As soon as the hook hit the pavement with a heavy thud, the alarm stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. Mason stood, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at his lips as he looked at Karen. Well, that was awkward. As the agents made their presence known, Karen's confidence began to crumble. The imposing figures in suits were not there to discuss neighborhood rules. They were there for something much more significant. The look of confusion and fear in her eyes was unmistakable as the agent holding the badge stepped forward, his demeanor calm but undeniably authoritative. Ma'am, he said to Karen, his voice devoid of sympathy, interfering with government property is a federal offense. You've made a grave mistake. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She had no idea what was happening. One moment she was triumphantly ordering a tow on what she thought was just another annoying car, and the next she was face to face with federal agents. The sudden shift in power left her floundering for any sort of defense. But no defense would come. The agents were not interested in her protests. They swiftly turned to the tow truck driver, instructing him to release the vehicle. The driver, visibly shaken, complied immediately. As the car was unharmed, Mason stood with his arms crossed, observing the scene with a quiet sense of satisfaction. With the car safely back in place and the agent's brief task completed, the agents turned their attention to Karen, whose face was pale and strained. The tall agent who had spoken earlier now addressed her directly. You're aware that unauthorized interference with government property is a federal crime, correct? Karen, still reeling, could barely process the weight of the situation. I, I didn't know, she stammered. I thought it was just an old junk car. Junk or not, the agent continued with unyielding professionalism, you don't have the right to seize a government vehicle. Mason, standing to the side, couldn't suppress a slight grin as he watched Karen attempt to regain her composure. She had been so sure of her authority, so certain that she could wield her HOA power without consequences. Now, the tables had turned, and it was painfully clear she had underestimated him. The agent, clearly done with the interaction, turned his gaze to Mason. Sir, would you like to press charges? Mason considered this carefully. The temptation to press charges was strong, but he paused, thinking of how much amusement he'd already gotten from watching Karen squirm. She had learned her lesson, at least for now. Nah, Mason replied after a long pause. I think she's learned her lesson. The agent raised an eyebrow, but then nodded in agreement. The other agent gave Karen one last, disapproving look before he turned back to Mason. We'll be keeping an eye on this situation, the agent said, before signaling to the driver to leave. The tow truck sped away, and the SUVs followed soon after, leaving behind only the lingering sense of quiet tension. Mason couldn't resist the opportunity to add one final remark, his voice dripping with barely contained amusement. Well, Karen, he said, crossing his arms and leaning against the hood of his car, I think it's safe to say this didn't go the way you planned. Karen, humiliated and defeated, looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Without a word, she turned sharply on her heel, her clipboard still clutched tightly in her hand as she retreated toward her house. The scene that followed was nothing short of dramatic. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. By the time Monday rolled around, everyone had heard a version of what had happened, each telling more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed that Karen had tried to steal a military prototype. Others swore that she had been handcuffed by the CIA agents and dragged away. The reality was far less sensational, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Karen, who had once been the queen of the neighborhood, was now the object of ridicule. She had failed spectacularly in her attempt to assert control over Mason, and the fallout from her actions rippled through the community. But Karen, ever defiant, refused to let the humiliation end there. Despite the public disgrace, she did not retreat quietly into obscurity. Instead, she doubled down on her own narrative, telling neighbors that Mason had somehow tricked her, that his car was part of some elaborate government scheme to ruin her life. She thinks I 3D printed federal agents too? Mason chuckled one morning, recounting the latest absurdity to a neighbor. Well, she doesn't seem like someone who's in touch with reality, Tom, his neighbor, replied, grinning. But you know what they say, reality is optional for some people. The absurdity of Karen's behavior wasn't just funny, it was starting to expose the cracks in her leadership. Neighbors who had previously been passive in their dealings with her were beginning to question her credibility. If she could make such a monumental mistake over a car, what else had she been wrong about? As the weeks went by, whispers began to circulate. Karen's grip on her position as HOA president began to loosen. More and more people started to voice their doubts about her leadership. And eventually one person, Linda, a quiet but diligent board member, began digging into Karen's financial dealings. What Linda uncovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. Karen, not one to back down from a fight, decided to take matters into her own hands once again. She filed a lawsuit against Mason, accusing him of causing her intentional emotional distress and public humiliation. It was absurd, but Karen was determined to have the last word. To her, this was her final stand. She had lost the power she once wielded with such ease, and now she was trying to regain control by punishing Mason for daring to challenge her authority. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, with people murmuring as they took their seats. Mason stood at the back of the room, his posture calm, but his mind sharp. This wasn't just about winning or losing a case. It was about putting an end to Karen's reign of terror over the neighborhood once and for all. Karen took the stand first, dramatically pointing at Mason as she began her testimony. This man, she began, her voice shaking with feigned emotion, has made my life a living nightmare. He tricked me into believing his car was just an ordinary vehicle. But no, he deceived me. He used that car to humiliate me, to ruin my reputation. She paused, taking a deep breath as she looked toward the jury. I thought I was doing the right thing, following the rules of the neighborhood, but instead, he has dragged me through the mud, making me out to be some kind of villain. I never wanted any of this. Mason watched her closely, barely hiding his amusement. Her words were ridiculous, but they weren't surprising. This was Karen, always twisting the truth to fit her narrative. The judge, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, raised an eyebrow as Karen continued her rant. Are you suggesting, Mrs. Karen, that Mr. Mason intentionally set up this entire situation to discredit you? She asked, her voice flat. Karen nodded vigorously. Yes, he made sure I would tow his car. He knew it was a government vehicle all along. And now, because of him, I've lost everything. My position, my reputation, my dignity. The judge didn't seem convinced. That seems like quite a stretch, ma'am. Do you have any evidence to support this claim? Before Karen could respond, Mason's lawyer stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, if I may, let's focus on the facts. The plaintiff ordered a tow truck to remove my client's legally parked car from his own driveway, a vehicle that, as we now know, was never her property. She had no authority to tow it. Karen's face reddened, but she didn't back down. That car was a nuisance. I had every right to remove it. The lawyer shook his head. Your Honor, it's clear that the plaintiff acted without proper knowledge or authority. What's more, her actions led to a federal investigation. The tension in the room escalated as the courtroom doors opened. Two CIA agents dressed in dark suits entered, causing a ripple of surprise throughout the room. They walked to the stand, their faces unreadable, and took their places as witnesses. Karen's lawyer stood, eager to challenge them. Can you confirm, gentlemen, that the car in question was indeed a classified government vehicle? The agents remained calm, as if this was nothing more than a routine procedure. One of the agents adjusted his sunglasses and nodded. We can confirm that the vehicle was government property. Beyond that, we cannot discuss its specific classification. Karen's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. She stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. But that's not fair. I didn't know. I thought it was just some junky old car. The agent fixed her with a stern look. Interfering with government property is a federal offense, Mrs. Karen. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the agent's words hung in the air. Karen's bravado dissolved completely. The reality of what she had done, attempting to tow a government vehicle and causing a federal incident, had finally sunk in. The judge, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Karen, your actions were not only irresponsible, but also illegal. I'm afraid this case is over. Karen's face turned ashen as the judge banged the gavel. The lawsuit is dismissed. I suggest you reconsider your actions before pursuing further legal claims. Karen, utterly defeated, stood in stunned silence for a moment. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but no words came. Her claim had fallen apart, and there was nothing she could do to reverse the damage. Her days of wielding power over the neighborhood were officially over. As the courtroom emptied, Mason stood and turned to his lawyer. Well, that was easier than I expected, he said, his voice dry with amusement. The lawyer chuckled. Not every day you see someone try to sue the CIA and lose. After the court case was dismissed, Karen's once prominent position in the neighborhood was effectively shattered. Her attempt to take Mason to court had backfired spectacularly, and the fallout from her failed lawsuit spread like wildfire. As soon as news of her courtroom defeat hit the neighborhood, people began to rethink everything they'd ever known about Karen. The woman who had once issued fines for the smallest infractions, who had wielded her power with an iron fist, was now exposed for what she truly was: self-serving, manipulative, and, in the end, utterly out of her depth. The whispers began to ripple through the community. Neighbors who had previously tolerated her or kept their heads down now began to question her leadership. How could they have allowed someone so reckless to control their lives? How many rules had she bent for her own gain? The cracks in her authority, once hidden beneath a polished facade, were now wide open for all to see. But the real breaking point came when Linda, the quiet board member who had uncovered Karen's financial mismanagement, presented her findings at the next HOA meeting. She revealed the truth behind the community beautification funds that Karen had pocketed for personal projects, like the unnecessary white picket fence around her house and the high-end security cameras pointing suspiciously at Mason's property. The revelations were explosive. What had once been a tightly knit community was now a battlefield, and Karen was at the center of it. The next HOA meeting was like a public execution of Karen's reputation. The community center was packed, the air thick with anticipation, as Karen took her usual seat at the head of the table, clipboard still in hand, desperately trying to maintain her composure. As Linda stood up and laid out the financial discrepancies for everyone to see, the shock was palpable. Karen's face went from pale to crimson as the crowd began murmuring, disbelief spreading through the room. The very people she had once lorded over were now turning their backs on her. By the end of the meeting, Karen's presidency had been suspended pending further investigation. She had lost her authority in the neighborhood, and with it, her credibility. For the first time, she was no longer the untouchable leader. She was just another resident, a woman whose arrogance and greed had cost her everything. But Karen wasn't done yet. She refused to accept defeat, even after the suspension. As if trying to salvage what little pride she had left, Karen filed one last lawsuit against Mason, claiming that he had caused her emotional distress and public humiliation. Yet again, an absurd attempt to shift the blame. This time, however, the case was doomed from the start. Everyone, including the judge, could see how utterly ridiculous it was. When the court reconvened, Karen's testimony was nothing short of unhinged. She continued to claim that Mason had orchestrated the entire situation to ruin her life, that the car, which she still insisted was a secret government weapon, had been part of some elaborate scheme to make her look foolish. Her dramatic outbursts, however, only fueled the courtroom's amusement. The judge, who had no patience for nonsense, quickly dismissed the case with a stern warning about wasting the court's time. The case was over in minutes. Karen, humiliated, was once again forced to face the reality of her actions. The CIA agents who had once intervened at Mason's request testified, reinforcing the severity of her interference with government property. The courtroom buzzed with whispers of Karen's ridiculous claims and her complete lack of awareness, sealing her fate as a local laughingstock. Once the case was dismissed, the damage to Karen's reputation was permanent. She had lost not only her role as HOA president, but also her standing in the community. Her credibility was destroyed beyond repair. Mason, on the other hand, was left with a quiet sense of victory. He hadn't sought revenge, but the natural consequences of Karen's actions had brought about the justice he had hoped for. In the weeks that followed, Karen, now a mere shadow of her former self, became a pariah in the neighborhood. People who had once feared her now avoided her, and her every move was watched with a mixture of pity and disdain. She no longer had the power to impose her will on anyone, and her house, once a symbol of her control, now felt cold and empty. For Mason, life slowly returned to normal. The neighborhood, freed from the grip of Karen's petty tyranny, began to heal. The new HOA president, a level-headed and fair-minded individual, scrapped many of the outdated and oppressive rules Karen had enforced. No more fines for minor offenses. No more petty demands for lawn maintenance. The neighborhood was finally free to breathe again. One evening, as Mason sat on his porch, savoring the peace that had finally returned to his life, he spotted Karen from across the street. She was unloading groceries from her car, struggling with the bags. Mason could have left her to her own devices, but something about the moment seemed too perfect to pass up. He leaned back in his chair, a quiet smirk crossing his face as he called out to her. "Need a tow?" Karen froze, her face flushing with anger as she turned to glare at him. But there was no response, no smug comeback, no attempt to assert control. She simply stormed inside, her groceries forgotten in the heat of the moment. Mason watched her retreat, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. It wasn't just about winning a petty battle over a car. It was about standing up to the kind of person who believed they could use others as pawns in their quest for control. And in the end, it was Karen's own arrogance and refusal to acknowledge her mistakes that had brought her downfall. For the first time since he moved in, Mason could finally park his car without fear of it being towed. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, had found its peace, and for Mason, it was a sweet, quiet victory. Hello, everyone. Today we bring you a gripping and insightful story about power, justice, and how an individual can stand up against unfair authority within a community. This is the story of John Carter, an ordinary man living a peaceful life in a quiet neighborhood, only for everything to be turned upside down when Linda Harper, the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, decides to interfere with his garden without consent. A garden that wasn't just a green space, but a symbol of sustainability and water conservation. But because it didn't fit Linda's standards, it was torn apart, setting off a chain of events that would catch the attention of the entire neighborhood. Can John stand up against the authority of someone like Linda? What lessons can be learned about rights and responsibilities within a community? Follow this thrilling story to find out. And don't forget, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on the story. What do you think about HOA power and how residents can protect their rights? Share your opinions in the comments below. To make sure you don't miss out on more exciting stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We'll continue bringing you interesting and meaningful content. Imagine waking up one morning to find your peaceful suburban life turned upside down. You've spent years cultivating a beautiful garden, a sanctuary that reflects your values of sustainability and water conservation, only to have someone come into your yard and tear it apart without your consent. Now, picture that person as someone with power, someone who thinks they can control every aspect of your life, all under the guise of enforcing neighborhood rules. This isn't a scene from a drama. This happened to me. My name is John Carter, and I never thought I'd be the one at the center of a scandal that would have the entire neighborhood talking. But when Linda Harper became the new president of the Homeowners Association in Maple Grove, my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. It started with something simple, my garden. A garden I had spent years designing, one that was drought-resistant and environmentally friendly. A garden that didn't fit into Linda's narrow vision of what a perfect lawn should be. What followed was a series of escalating events that would test not just my patience, but the very concept of authority and personal rights. This is the story of how a neighborhood garden became the battleground for justice, and how standing up against unfair authority can change everything. The trouble began soon after Linda Harper moved into Maple Grove. She wasn't like any other neighbor I had met before. With her perfectly styled hair, always pressed khakis, and that incessant air of authority, Linda made it clear from the start that she had plans, big plans, for the community. Little did I know, her first order of business would be my garden. I had always prided myself on my front yard. I spent countless weekends creating a drought-resistant landscape, carefully selecting plants that would thrive with minimal water. It wasn't just about saving money on the water bill, it was a statement. My garden was a living testament to environmental responsibility, and most of the neighbors had noticed. I'd received compliments from people like Tom, the friendly guy across the street, who'd even asked for advice on his own garden. But Linda? She wasn't impressed. It wasn't the aesthetics of the garden that bothered her. No, it was something much more rigid. She had a vision of what a perfect neighborhood should look like, and my garden didn't fit into that vision. One Friday afternoon, I returned home after a long day at work to find a note in my mailbox. It wasn't an ordinary flyer about a neighborhood event. It was a formal notice from the HOA. The first sentence alone caught my attention. Your landscaping does not conform to HOA standards. Confused, I read on. According to Linda, my garden violated the HOA's strict requirement that lawns must be at least 60% grass. I had no idea such a rule even existed. If it did, it was buried somewhere in fine print. The thing was, our neighborhood was built with drought conditions in mind. We all had to find creative ways to deal with the lack of rainfall, and I had done just that. The next day, Linda came to my door. I opened it to find her standing there, clipboard in hand, wearing that ever-present smug expression. "John, I'm afraid your yard doesn't meet the community standards," she said, looking me up and down as if she were speaking to a child. "I've already given you a notice, and I expect you to comply. We can't have a neighborhood that looks like this. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. Linda, with all due respect, my garden saves water. It's environmentally friendly. I even won an award from the city last year for water conservation. I was trying to explain, but she wasn't listening. Well, John, she said, her tone turning condescending, your award doesn't override the rules. You have 30 days to bring your yard up to code, or I'll have to take further action. The community's aesthetic must be maintained. I stared at her for a moment, incredulous. You're seriously going to make me tear up my garden? Rules are rules, she replied, giving me a tight smile before walking away, her heels clicking on the pavement. I stood there for a while, feeling the frustration building inside me. How could she be so blind to the purpose of my garden? But I wasn't about to let this slide. I decided to take action. That evening, I sat down to write an email to the HOA board, outlining my concerns and providing evidence of my garden's environmental benefits. I was hopeful that a reasonable discussion would solve this. I was wrong. The next day, Linda showed up again, this time armed with a tape measure. She was on my lawn, measuring the grass and shaking her head with exaggerated disapproval. I'm just documenting the violations, John. You'll get a copy of everything for your records. Linda, seriously? The HOA board hasn't even responded to my email yet. What gives you the right to act like this? I asked, my patience wearing thin. She looked at me with that same patronizing smile. As HOA president, it's my job to interpret the rules, John. And I'm interpreting them to mean that your yard is non-compliant. Have a nice day. I could feel the heat rising in my face as she walked away. It was clear she wasn't going to stop until she got her way. But I wasn't backing down. The next few days were a blur of notices and threats. I received 3 more formal letters from her, each one more demanding than the last. The final notice came with a warning. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $100 per day. I was livid, but I wasn't about to let some petty bureaucratic power trip ruin years of hard work. I contacted the other board members of the HOA, hoping to find some allies. To my relief, most of them agreed that Linda was going too far. They promised to address it at the next meeting, which was still 2 weeks away. I thought that would be the end of it, or at least a temporary reprieve. But I was wrong again. 2 weeks later, things came to a head. I had been out for work, preparing for an important meeting that morning. The day had already started with a bit of chaos, but I wasn't expecting it to spiral this quickly. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang. It was Tom, the neighbor across the street. I could hear the tension in his voice even before he spoke. John, he said urgently, you need to come home, now. Linda's got a landscaping crew in your yard, and they're tearing everything up. I tried to stop them, but she showed them some HOA papers, and they said they're authorized to do it. You need to get back here. My heart sank. I stood there for a moment, frozen. Tearing up my garden? The thought was almost too ridiculous to process. What do you mean, tearing everything up? I asked, feeling the panic creeping in. Are they digging up my plants? My garden? Why the hell would she do that? She's standing there, directing them. Tom explained. I don't know what's going on, but they're just digging up your entire yard. I've never seen anything like it. You need to come back. Quick. Without another word, I hung up. My mind raced as I grabbed my things and bolted out the door. I knew I wouldn't get there in time to stop whatever madness Linda had started, but I had to try. I could already feel the anger building in me. The drive home was a blur. I don't think I've ever pushed my car that fast, but it didn't matter. It felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. When I turned the corner onto my street, I saw the scene unfolding from a block away. A landscaping crew of 3 men was already well into destroying my garden. I could see the bushes I had planted with care, bushes that were drought-resistant and perfect for our climate being ripped from the ground. My beautiful, well-maintained yard, which had been a labor of love for years, was being torn apart before my eyes. And there she was, Linda, standing across the street, arms crossed, looking pleased as punch. Her smug smile was plastered on her face, like she was watching a victory unfold. I slammed my car door and stormed toward her, barely able to contain my rage. What the hell do you think you're doing, Linda? My voice carried down the street, and I didn't care who was watching. You can't just come onto my property and destroy everything. Linda didn't flinch. She stood there, practically glowing with authority, like she was in charge of everything. Enforcing the HOA covenant, John, she said, her voice as calm as ever. Your yard was given ample time to comply. This is Section 18, Paragraph 12. The HOA has the right to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense if they're not addressed in the specified time frame. You didn't respond to the notices, so we had to take action. I felt my blood boil. This is insane, I spat, my hands clenched into fists. You're destroying my property. You have no right to do this. This is criminal trespassing, Linda. I'm calling the police. Go ahead, she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. I have the legal right to do this. It's in the covenant you signed when you bought the house. And besides, you ignored the warnings. I pulled out my phone, ready to make the call. But before I could dial, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. The unmistakable sound of water, gushing water. At first, it was a small trickle, but it quickly grew louder. I turned toward the workers, who were now scrambling around, shouting in Spanish. I didn't need to understand every word, but I caught the panic in their voices. They were shouting about the tuberia, the pipe. I ran toward the sound of the rushing water, my stomach dropping as I realized what had happened. In their eagerness to dig up my garden, one of the workers had hit my sprinkler line. And not just any sprinkler line. This was the connection where my irrigation system tied into the city's water main. Water was pouring out, fast and furious. It was spraying in every direction, flooding the yard, spilling onto the street, and heading straight for Linda's pristine lawn. I could see the horror on her face now as she finally understood the mess she'd created. Turn it off, Linda screeched, her face turning red as her hair started to wilt under the pressure of the humid air. She stepped forward, but I held up my hand to stop her. I can't just turn it off, Linda, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. This is a direct line to the city water main. Only city workers can turn it off at the street level. The workers were in a panic, trying to cover the hole with their hands, but it was too much. The water was everywhere now, flooding the streets and edging closer to the sidewalks. I could see Linda's well-manicured yard beginning to flood. It was almost poetic in a way. I took out my phone and called 911. Hi, I need to report a water main break at 435 Maple Crest Drive, I said, trying to stay calm despite the rage bubbling inside me. A landscaping crew, under the direction of Linda Harper from the Maple Grove HOA, has damaged a connection to the city's water main. Water is flooding the street, and we need emergency services. I could feel Linda's eyes on me as I finished the call. Her expression had gone from smug satisfaction to pure panic. You didn't tell me there was a city connection there, she spat. Her composure was slipping fast. I raised an eyebrow. Actually, Linda, it's clearly marked on the property survey that's on file with both the city and the HOA. You should have reviewed those documents before authorizing this work. More neighbors were gathering now, watching the water rush down the street. I could hear murmurs, and I knew word would spread quickly. The flood was making its way toward Linda's pristine lawn, and I could see her growing more and more frantic. In the distance, I heard sirens. The fire department arrived first, followed by a city utilities truck. The firefighters began to assess the situation, while the utilities team rushed to locate the street-level shutoff valve. The water kept rushing out, flooding the street and inching closer to the neighbors' houses. The fire captain, a stern woman named Captain Morris, approached us. Who's responsible for this? She asked, her gaze moving between me, Linda, and the workers. Before I could speak, Linda stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. This is John Carter's property, she said, trying to deflect blame. The pipe is his responsibility. Captain Morris raised an eyebrow. Did you call 811 before digging? She asked. Linda didn't answer. The silence was enough of an admission. Ma'am, it's a legal requirement to have utilities marked before any excavation takes place, Captain Morris said. And based on what Mr. Carter is telling me, you may not have had the authority to do any of this in the first place. The utilities team was already hard at work, trying to stop the flow of water, but the damage was done. It would take more than a few hours to fix, and the cost was going to be astronomical. As the workers began trying to control the flooding, the police arrived. They began taking statements from everyone, including the neighbors who had gathered to watch. I gave them my account of what had happened, and soon enough, Linda was being questioned. One of the officers pulled me aside and asked, "Do you want to press charges for criminal trespassing and destruction of property?" I thought about it for a moment, looking at Linda, who was now sitting on the curb, her designer khakis soaked in mascara running down her face. The scene was almost surreal. "No," I said, after a brief pause. "I think the fines and repairs will be enough for her. But I do want this officially documented in case it happens again." The officer nodded, making a note in his report. "The city will likely pursue charges for the utility damage. You don't have control over that." By the time the emergency services managed to contain the flood, it felt like the whole neighborhood had witnessed the disaster unfold. Linda, who had once prided herself on her control over Maple Grove, now sat on the curb, defeated, her khakis soaked through and her once perfect hair now flat and frizzy from the humidity. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and horror. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had bulldozed it into oblivion. The fire department and city workers worked tirelessly to stop the flow of water, but the damage was extensive. The street had transformed into a shallow river, with water creeping up onto lawns, sidewalks, and even a few driveways. I couldn't help but watch as the floodwaters slowly made their way toward Linda's pristine yard, a small dose of poetic justice in the midst of chaos. The utilities team finally shut off the water, but by then, it was clear that this wasn't just a simple mistake. The excavation had struck a crucial connection to the city's water main, one that required professional oversight and legal clearance before being disturbed. There was no denying it. Linda had caused a disaster. As the sirens faded into the distance, the police began taking statements from everyone present. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle now became key witnesses. I was interviewed about the sequence of events, and I made sure to tell them everything. How Linda had come onto my property without permission, how she had ordered the crew to dig up my garden, and how the damage had led to a citywide utility issue. Linda, on the other hand, was trying to justify her actions to the officers. She insisted she had the authority to do what she did, and the more she talked, the more her story seemed to unravel. Her attempts at self-defense were growing more strained, and I couldn't help but notice the cracks in her facade. One of the officers pulled me aside and said, "Mr. Carter, do you want to press charges for criminal trespassing and destruction of property?" For a moment, I stood there, watching Linda in the distance. I could see the tension in her body, the way her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the wet hair from her face. Part of me wanted to see her face the consequences of what she'd done. But another part of me, the part that had worked so hard to stay calm throughout all of this, just wanted to make sure things were handled the right way. "No," I said, my voice firm but calm. "I think the fines and the cost of repairs will be enough to make her realize the seriousness of what she's done. But I do want this situation documented properly, just in case." The officer nodded, jotting down the information in his report. "Understood. The city will likely pursue charges for the utility damage, but that's out of your hands." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal and administrative proceedings. The damage to the water main had been extensive, and the city sent a bill for $112,000 for the repairs. But that wasn't all. The city also slapped Maple Grove's HOA with a fine of nearly $88,000 for the unauthorized excavation that had caused the breach. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Linda had insisted that she was acting within her rights, but now the HOA was facing the consequences. It wasn't just my garden that had been destroyed. It was the HOA's credibility, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the entire board would have to answer for it. A special meeting was called to address the situation, and I made sure to attend. The room was tense with anticipation. Linda, who had once walked into every room like she owned it, now looked completely defeated. She had lost her composure, and the arrogance that had once defined her was now replaced with an uncomfortable silence. One by one, the board members took their seats, their expressions grim. I could tell that the HOA was divided. Some members, who had been hesitant to challenge Linda before, now seemed ready to hold her accountable for the mess she had caused. When the meeting began, the board members started by reviewing the situation in detail. Several homeowners voiced their concerns about Linda's behavior, about how she had abused her position of power and violated HOA protocols. And then, the one person who had been silent through most of the proceedings stood up. Mark Green, the interim president of the HOA, cleared his throat and turned toward Linda. "Linda," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "you've put the HOA in a position where we're now responsible for over $200,000 in damages and fines. This is not what we were elected to do. We are supposed to protect the property values and interests of the homeowners, not create a financial disaster." Linda's face flushed a deep red, and I could see the tears welling in her eyes. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. It was clear she was trying to salvage her dignity, but there was no coming back from this. "We need to address this immediately," Mark continued. "I'm recommending that we remove Linda as president. We can't allow this kind of overreach to continue. The community's trust has been shattered." The room fell silent. I could see Linda's jaw tightening, but she knew deep down there was nothing she could do. The board voted, and within minutes, Linda Harper was officially removed from her position as HOA president. The vote was unanimous. I watched as Linda slowly gathered her things, her shoulders hunched, her head low. She left the room without a word, and the tension in the air dissipated, replaced with a sense of cautious relief. In the weeks that followed, the changes came quickly. The board issued a formal apology to the residents of Maple Grove, and Mark Green took charge as interim president. The HOA's bylaws were revised to ensure something like this would never happen again. From that day forward, no action could be taken without the agreement of at least 3 board members, and any enforcement of rules required documented approval. And as for my garden, well, it became a symbol of what happens when you stand up to unjust authority. The HOA hired a professional landscaping company to restore it to its original state, and I worked closely with them to improve upon the design. The city's water conservation department was so impressed with the restoration that they offered to feature my garden in their next public awareness campaign. My garden, once just a personal project, had now become a local attraction. Neighbors who had once been hesitant about the changes in the community began to stop by to admire it. I even started hosting monthly gardening workshops for those interested in reducing their water usage and creating more sustainable landscapes. But it wasn't just about the garden. It was about standing up for what was right, and in doing so, I had helped change the very fabric of our neighborhood. The lesson? When you refuse to back down in the face of unjust authority, you not only protect your own rights, you create change that benefits everyone. A few weeks after Linda's removal from office, the full weight of the incident began to settle in. Maple Grove was buzzing with conversation. It felt like everyone had a piece of the story to share. But this wasn't the kind of gossip that usually died down after a couple of days. It had taken root, spreading far beyond the borders of our neighborhood. For me, the calm that followed the storm was a welcome relief. My garden had been professionally restored, and thanks to the city's water conservation department, it was now a shining example of sustainable landscaping. The workshops I hosted became a hit, with neighbors and even some local schools sending groups to learn about water conservation and eco-friendly gardening practices. What had started as a personal hobby had grown into something much bigger, something that had the potential to change the way our community, and maybe even the wider city, viewed sustainable living. But not everyone was happy with how things had turned out. The HOA board's decision to overhaul the community guidelines after Linda's actions didn't sit well with some. There were whispers, mostly from people who hadn't been directly involved in the situation, that perhaps the board had overreacted. Some even suggested that I had been too quick to escalate the situation. It didn't bother me much. I knew the truth. Linda's behavior had been unreasonable from the start, and the damage she had caused couldn't be ignored. She had crossed a line, and it was because of that line being crossed that the changes in the HOA were made. The neighborhood had to learn to respect boundaries, not just physical ones, but personal and legal ones too. A few days after the emergency board meeting, I ran into Mark Green, the new interim president of the HOA, at the local coffee shop. I had been meaning to speak with him about the new direction the HOA was taking, but the timing hadn't felt right. Now it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I approached him, a friendly smile on my face. "Hey Mark, you've been doing a great job with everything. The community feels different, more cooperative." Mark looked up from his coffee, smiling back, though there was a flicker of exhaustion in his eyes. "It's been a wild few weeks, John, but we're making progress. We've been revising the bylaws, tightening up the language, and making sure something like what happened with Linda never happens again." I nodded, impressed by the changes. "That's great. I think the whole neighborhood will benefit from it. But I've been thinking, what's the next step? How do we move forward from here?" He sighed, taking a sip of his coffee before answering. "That's the tricky part. You see, the community's changed. People are still divided over how Linda was removed. Some people are relieved, but others feel like there wasn't enough time for a full discussion before things got so dramatic." "I get that," I said. But honestly, things had already reached a breaking point. We couldn't just keep pretending everything was fine while Linda ran roughshod over everyone's rights. The damage was done, and someone had to do something. Mark leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "You're right. I just don't know how to bridge that gap. How do we make sure the board stays balanced without falling into the same trap as Linda did?" I thought about it for a moment, then gave him an idea. Why not bring in more input from the community? Hold regular meetings where homeowners can voice their concerns, vote on changes, and maybe even have some neighborhood representatives join the board temporarily. Give everyone a sense of ownership in the decision-making process. Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's actually a great idea. Involve more voices, create more transparency. I think it could work. I'll bring it up at the next meeting." I was glad to see him enthusiastic about the idea. It wasn't going to solve everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. One of the biggest lessons I had learned in all of this was the importance of communication. Without it, everything, no matter how well-intentioned, could fall apart. And as much as I had wanted to fix things quickly, the process of healing and rebuilding was far more complex than I had realized. That afternoon, after leaving the coffee shop, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short amount of time. Maple Grove was still the same suburban neighborhood I had moved into years ago, but it now felt different. The air felt lighter, and there was a new sense of camaraderie among the residents. People were looking out for one another, and slowly but surely, the community was becoming more open to new ideas, even those that had once been seen as controversial. But the true test was yet to come. Over the next few months, the HOA made significant strides in rewriting the bylaws. They redefined what constituted an attractive yard, focusing more on sustainability and eco-friendly landscaping than on rigid standards that only served to limit creativity. They also made it clear that any decisions about yard enforcement had to be approved by a majority of the board, ensuring that no one person could act unilaterally as Linda had done. Despite the positive changes, there was still one more thing that haunted me. As much as I had moved on from the drama, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda hadn't truly learned from her mistakes. There was still a part of me that wondered if she was out there, somewhere, plotting her next move. I wasn't sure if that was paranoia or if it was just the bitter taste of unresolved conflict. Either way, I knew that I couldn't control what she did next. What I could control was the impact I had on my community. A month later, while I was in the middle of hosting one of my gardening workshops, I had an encounter I hadn't expected. I was giving a talk about water conservation techniques when I overheard a familiar voice in the aisle behind me. It was Linda. It had been a month since the chaos that reshaped Maple Grove. Life had returned to a new normal. The HOA bylaws had been updated to reflect more sustainable and inclusive policies, and the community had begun to recover. My garden, now a local symbol of environmental responsibility, had become a focal point for neighborhood pride. People were visiting to learn about water conservation and eco-friendly landscaping, and the workshops I hosted had attracted a steady stream of interested residents. But as it often happens, just when things start to feel settled, life throws a curveball. One sunny afternoon, while I was in the middle of a gardening workshop, I overheard a voice that sent a chill down my spine. It was a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "I have extensive experience in homeowners association management," the voice said. I didn't recognize the person she was talking to, but I knew that voice, the tone, the arrogance. It was Linda Harper. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. She was here, in our local hardware store, talking about property management. Of all places. I tried to keep calm, but my curiosity got the best of me. Slowly, I walked toward the end of the aisle, trying to remain unobtrusive, and peered around the corner. There she was, standing beside a man in a sharp suit. The man nodded, clearly interested in whatever Linda was saying, and I couldn't help but listen. "I recently served as the president of the Maple Grove HOA," Linda continued, her voice carrying with that same confident tone I had once dreaded. "I worked hard to improve the community, and I believe I really made a difference." My stomach churned. She was talking about the very situation that had caused so much trouble, the disaster she'd created, the mess she'd left behind, and now she was acting as if nothing had happened. It was like she was rewriting history, erasing all the chaos she had caused. I felt a surge of anger rising in me, but I took a deep breath, calming myself. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation. I had learned from the past. Confrontation wasn't always the answer. But this was too good an opportunity to pass up. I turned the corner and casually walked up to the aisle where they were standing. Linda's eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment I could see a flash of recognition. Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Well, if it isn't John Carter," she said, her voice tight but still carrying that air of authority. "Linda," I said coolly, matching her forced smile. "Fancy meeting you here. I didn't expect to run into you at a hardware store. What's the latest? More HOA management, I suppose?" The man beside her, who I now recognized as someone from Lakeside Village Property Management, gave me a quick, polite smile and extended his hand. "Robert Daniels," he said. "I've been speaking with Linda about a potential role overseeing a few of our communities. She's been very informative." I shook his hand, maintaining my composure. "Nice to meet you, Robert. I've heard a lot about Linda's work here. How could I not, given the impact she had on Maple Grove?" Linda's eyes flickered with discomfort, but she quickly tried to smooth things over. "Well, you know," she said, "I did what I thought was best for the community. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions." I nodded slowly, pretending to buy her words. Tough decisions indeed. Like the one where you unilaterally decided to tear up my garden without permission? Or the one where you flooded the street and caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages? I guess that's your idea of making a difference, huh? Linda's face went pale, her earlier bravado vanishing. Robert, who had been listening intently, blinked and took a step back, clearly taken aback by the mention of the incident. I didn't stop there. "Oh, and I'm sure you'll want to ask her about the $112,000 water main repair bill that the HOA had to pay for her." "Little mistake," I continued, the words almost tasting sweet as I saw Linda's face flush. "Not to mention the $88,000 in fines the city slapped on the HOA for unauthorized excavation." Robert's eyebrows shot up, and Linda's expression turned from shocked to angry in a flash. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She seemed to be calculating whether to deny it, but it was too late. Her past had caught up with her. "Not exactly how I remember it," she sputtered, clearly rattled. "Oh, I remember it clearly," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I was there, watching it all unfold. And if you ever need a refresher, you can always check the police and city reports. Everything's public record. It's all there. So, Robert, I just wanted to make sure you have all the information before making any decisions about hiring Linda here. You might want to do a bit more due diligence." I gave him a friendly smile, then turned to leave. But before I could walk away, I felt Linda's eyes on me, burning into my back. I couldn't resist one last jab. "Good luck with the job search, Linda," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You'll need it." As I walked away, I could hear the sound of Linda's sharp, indignant breath behind me. But I wasn't done. I knew this wasn't the end of the story for her. It couldn't be. The next day, I received a call from Mark Green, the interim president of the HOA. He had some interesting news for me. "John," he said, "I think you need to know something. Word's spreading about Linda applying for property management positions. And it's not just Lakeside Village. There are other companies out there looking at her too. We might have to step in before she causes more trouble." I paused, considering the options. Options. I know she's been busy rewriting her story, but I didn't think she'd try to get back into the game this soon, I replied. "What are we going to do about it?" Mark sighed. "We're drafting a letter to any prospective employers just to make sure they're fully informed about her actions as HOA president. It's our responsibility to protect the community from someone like that." I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about petty revenge. It was about making sure that someone who had caused so much harm couldn't just walk away unscathed and try to do it all over again. Maple Grove needed to remain a place where fairness and transparency prevailed, not where people like Linda could exploit their positions for personal gain. In the weeks that followed my unexpected encounter with Linda at the hardware store, things settled into a strange kind of equilibrium. The letter to Linda's prospective employers had been sent, and the response had been swift. The property management companies, now armed with the full account of her actions in Maple Grove, had decided not to hire her. It wasn't a surprise. When the full extent of her misdeeds came to light, even the most desperate organizations didn't want to risk the fallout. Her professional reputation had been shattered, and I could only imagine the personal toll it had taken on her. As for Maple Grove, life began to return to a new normal. The community had weathered a storm, and we were stronger for it. The changes to the HOA bylaws had brought about a shift in how the neighborhood operated. The board, now committed to transparency, held monthly meetings where residents were encouraged to voice their opinions. No longer were decisions made behind closed doors. No longer would any one person wield the kind of unchecked power that Linda had once used to manipulate the entire neighborhood. My garden, once just a personal project, had become a symbol for something larger. I had started with a dream of creating a water-efficient, environmentally responsible yard, and now it was a living example of what we could achieve when we worked together. The workshops I held were more popular than ever, and I had even been invited to speak at a local environmental conference. People were beginning to see the value of sustainability, not just in the garden, but in how we lived our daily lives. I was proud of what I had accomplished, but more importantly, I was proud of the community that had rallied together to ensure that something like the events surrounding Linda's reign as HOA president would never happen again. Yet, as I sat in my garden one evening, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I couldn't shake the feeling that this chapter wasn't just about the destruction of one garden or the removal of one overbearing HOA president. It was a lesson in the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it seems like the odds are against you. For me, this entire ordeal had been a crash course in the power of persistence and the consequences of unchecked authority. Linda's actions had sparked a chain reaction, one that ultimately led to positive change, but it had come at a cost. People had been hurt, relationships had been tested, and trust had been broken. In the end, though, that was the price of progress. It was through the pain and struggle that we were able to find clarity, and it was through the mistakes of the past that we had built something stronger for the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought back to the very first moment I had realized what was happening. When I first saw the crew tearing up my garden, I had been furious. I had wanted to lash out, to fight fire with fire. But as the days went by, I learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to deal with injustice is with patience, clarity, and a focus on the long-term goal. Linda had learned her lesson, though not in the way I had hoped. She had been removed from her position, publicly humiliated, and had to watch as everything she had tried to control fell apart. But the real lesson wasn't just in her defeat. It was in the victory of the entire community, which had stood up for what was right, no matter how difficult the battle seemed. In the end, my garden flourished, the neighborhood thrived, and we all learned that sometimes standing up to unjust authority isn't just about winning. It's about making sure that the values we hold dear are protected and passed on to the next generation. And in that, we had all succeeded. As I looked at the green, thriving plants in front of me, I smiled. The water ran through the pipes again, as it always had, but this time it was accompanied by a quiet sense of satisfaction. The fight for fairness and justice had been long, but it had been worth it. And every time the sprinkler system clicked on, I knew I had helped make a difference, not just in my garden, but in my entire community. And that, I thought, was the greatest reward of all. In the months that followed, Linda eventually sold her house. The whispers and looks of judgment from the neighbors had become too much for her to bear. She moved into a condominium with no yard to speak of, a fitting end for someone who had once tried to control everything around her. As for Maple Grove, the changes that Linda's actions had triggered continued to bear fruit. The HOA board remained transparent and accountable, and our community thrived in a way it hadn't in years. My garden became a local landmark, and the workshops I hosted flourished, teaching others how to conserve water and create beautiful, sustainable landscapes. So, what do you think about John's journey? How do you feel about the role of homeowners associations in your own community? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on more inspiring tales like this. Join us as we continue to explore meaningful stories. A story about the confrontation between a firefighter and a seemingly small but deeply revealing neighborhood association, highlighting important lessons on justice, power, and sacrifice. Imagine you've just finished a grueling shift, saving lives, only to return home hoping for some rest. But instead, you find a fine slapped on your door for parking in front of your house while you were out saving people. This is the story of Daniel Foster, a dedicated firefighter, and his battle with the HOA president, Karen Mitchell, over a rule that put regulations above the safety of human lives. This tale isn't just about a fight over a parking ticket. It's a reflection of the deeper issues surrounding authority, fairness, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Continue reading to witness the tension, debates, and pivotal decisions in Daniel's quest for justice, and find out if fairness can truly prevail in a world dominated by rules that seem more about control than compassion. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Do you agree with Daniel's stand against unreasonable regulations, or do you think there could have been a more balanced solution? Share your opinion in the comments below. And don't forget to watch until the end of the story to uncover the unexpected conclusion and the major changes in this community. After a brutal 24-hour shift, Daniel Foster, a seasoned firefighter, finally pulls into his driveway, hoping to rest and recover. But as he steps out of his truck, his phone rings. In an instant, he shifts from exhaustion to adrenaline, an emergency call. Racing toward a burning building, he faces the flames with unwavering courage, rescuing children and their grandmother from a deadly inferno. It's another day on the job, another life saved. But as he returns home, ready to finally catch his breath, something unexpected catches his eye. A crisp $300 fine taped to his front door. The reason? Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, had decided that his truck, parked in front of his own home while he responded to an emergency, violated the neighborhood's strict rules. This seemingly small violation would soon ignite a battle that would pit one man's sense of duty against the suffocating grip of a bureaucracy that valued power over reason. What began as a simple fine soon became a fight for justice, a fight that no one expected, but one that would change the neighborhood forever. Daniel Foster had always prided himself on his dedication to his job as a firefighter. He knew that every call was a matter of life or death, and that every second counted. So when he and his team were dispatched to a fire in an apartment complex, Daniel didn't hesitate. The fire was intense, smoke billowed from the windows, and the heat was almost unbearable. People were trapped on the upper floors, including 2 young children and their grandmother. As Daniel charged through the burning building, The sound of cracking beams echoed in his ears. He could barely see through the thick smoke, but he heard the desperate cries of the children. Without a second thought, he moved toward the voices, ignoring the danger. He was used to this. Saving lives was what he did best. After what felt like hours, Daniel emerged from the smoke with the children and their grandmother in his arms, carrying them to safety. The moment he stepped out onto the balcony and placed the children safely on the ladder, the building creaked ominously behind him. Daniel felt a jolt of fear, but there was no time for that now. He had done his job. As the crew pulled everyone to safety, Daniel took one last look at the inferno before running to his truck and heading home, exhausted but relieved. When he pulled into his driveway that night, the last thing he expected to see was an official-looking envelope taped to his door. He sighed, wiping the sweat and soot from his brow, thinking it was just a bill or some form of paperwork. But as he ripped open the letter, his heart sank. $300 fine for unauthorized street parking. Daniel stared at the letter in disbelief. How could this be? He had parked in front of his house just for a few minutes to respond to an emergency. He hadn't even been there overnight, and yet here he was, being penalized for doing his job. He muttered to himself, "This can't be real. It's got to be a mistake." But when he saw Karen Mitchell's name at the bottom of the letter, it all clicked. Karen was the president of the HOA, known for enforcing the most ridiculous rules in the neighborhood. Daniel had heard stories from his neighbors about fines for everything from the wrong color of flowers to a lawn that wasn't green enough. But he never imagined that Karen would turn her attention to him. As he stood there, still holding the letter, Karen herself appeared from behind her front door. Daniel could feel his frustration building. He tried to take a deep breath, but the anger was already rising in his chest. "I see you got my notice," Karen said, her voice dripping with false politeness as she crossed her arms, looking at him with a smug expression. "You fined me for parking in front of my own house while responding to an emergency," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "How is that even possible?" Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by the gravity of his situation. "The rules are the rules," she replied coolly. "No exceptions. Vehicles must be parked in designated spaces, not on the street." "I was saving lives," Daniel nearly shouted, his patience slipping. "You really think that's more important than some arbitrary parking rule?" Karen shrugged nonchalantly, a smug smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Everyone has to follow the rules. Otherwise, what kind of example does that set? Chaos! That's what! Chaos!" Daniel barked, his blood boiling. "You want to talk about chaos? What about the lives I just saved? What about the family I just rescued from a burning building? And you're telling me I should be punished for that?" Karen's expression didn't change. "That's admirable, truly," she said in a tone that couldn't have been less sincere. "But we have regulations for a reason. If I start making exceptions, people will think they can park wherever they please. What if everyone decided their emergency was more important than the rules?" "You don't get it," Daniel said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't about me wanting to park where I please. This is about me doing my job. What if your house was on fire and I had to park my truck outside because the garage was full of emergency equipment? Would you still be whining about where I parked?" Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with a raised chin. "My house wouldn't be on fire because I follow the rules." That comment hit Daniel like a slap across the face. His fingers clenched around the fine, his grip tightening until the paper crinkled under the pressure. "I don't know how you sleep at night," he muttered, his anger barely contained. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered. "Well, it's clear you're upset. If you really feel strongly about this, you can appeal the fine at the next HOA meeting." "Oh, I will," Daniel said, his voice dark with determination. "I'll make sure everyone knows about this. You can't just punish people for doing the right thing." As he turned and walked toward his house, the weight of the fine in his hand felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The next day, Daniel woke up early, still seething from his confrontation with Karen Mitchell. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon as he tried to focus on the work ahead. But his thoughts kept drifting back to that absurd fine, $300 for doing his job. As he sat at the kitchen table, a sharp ring of the fire station's bell broke the silence. It was an emergency call. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his gear, his focus shifting to the task at hand. Another fire, another family in need. As he rushed to his truck, the weight of the previous night's events momentarily faded. There was no time to dwell on an unjust fine. Lives were at stake. Daniel quickly drove to the scene, pushing through the still dark streets, his mind focused only on saving people. The fire was a disaster, engulfing an apartment complex with thick black smoke pouring out from the windows. When he arrived, chaos reigned. A terrified family was trapped on the third floor, unable to escape the inferno. Daniel didn't even hesitate. He grabbed his axe and his mask, rushing into the building, his lungs burning from the heat and smoke. His body had been pushed to the limit the previous day, but he was determined to save whoever he could. The flames were hot, intense, suffocating even, but Daniel was no stranger to danger. With every step, his training kicked in. The sound of cracking beams echoed through the building, but Daniel pressed forward, guided only by the faint sound of children's cries. Finally, through the smoke, he saw them, a grandmother and her grandchildren, huddling in the corner of a room, their faces streaked with soot. They were alive, but scared out of their minds. Daniel quickly moved in, wrapping the children in his arms and shielding them as best as he could. The fire was relentless, but Daniel wasn't going to let it take them. With the children and their grandmother in tow, he carefully maneuvered through the smoke and debris, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard the crackling of the building around him, the roar of the fire threatening to swallow them whole. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, they reached the balcony. Daniel helped the children onto the ladder, ensuring they were safely lowered to the ground before pulling the grandmother down. As the flames surged behind him, he felt the intense heat on his back and knew that every second counted. Just as he made it to safety, a loud crack echoed from above. Part of the building collapsed, sending debris crashing down. For a brief moment, Daniel feared for his life, but his captain grabbed him, pulling him to safety just in time. They had made it out. Another family saved, another job well done. But as Daniel took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes landed on his fire truck, still parked in front of his house, just a few minutes away. After the fire was under control, Daniel made his way back home, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his heart light with the satisfaction of knowing he had saved lives. His truck, once again parked in front of his house, was the last thing on his mind. He barely had the energy to pull into his driveway. His hands were blistered, his uniform singed, and his mind was still racing from the chaos of the fire. He just needed to get inside, shower, and rest. But as he stepped out of the truck, something caught his eye, the same crisp envelope still taped to his front door. His stomach churned as he walked closer, feeling the anger rise again. It was as if Karen had been waiting for him to come home. He ripped open the letter, dreading what it would say. The bold text hit him like a punch in the gut. $300 fine, unauthorized parking. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. He had been out saving lives, and this was what he returned to. As he stood there, shaking his head in disbelief, he heard the sound of someone approaching. It was Karen. Of course it was. "Got my notice, I see," she said, her tone as condescending as ever, arms crossed over her chest, a smug look plastered across her face. "Karen," Daniel started, trying to keep his cool, "I just got back from saving a family from a fire. You fined me for parking my truck in front of my house, responding to an emergency." Karen didn't even flinch. "The rules are the rules, Daniel. There are no exceptions. I don't care what you were doing. You violated them." "I wasn't violating anything. I was saving lives." His voice was rising now, the frustration finally bubbling over. Karen gave him a thin smile. "And I truly appreciate your service, but rules are in place for a reason. If we let one person break them, everyone will think they can do the same." "You're missing the point entirely." Daniel shook his head, feeling the anger flood his veins. "You'd rather enforce petty rules than acknowledge the reality of what I do? What happens when one of you needs saving and I'm stuck worrying about parking my truck?" "You're welcome to appeal the fine," she said with a dismissive wave. The next HOA meeting is where you can make your case." "I'll be there," Daniel replied sharply. "And believe me, I'll make sure everyone knows what's really important around here." As Karen turned and walked back to her house, her expression unchanging, Daniel stood there in the driveway, his blood still boiling. He had just come from a life-threatening situation, and yet he was being treated like a criminal for parking on the street. The tension had been building for days. Daniel wasn't about to let this go. The fine was the last straw in a long line of ridiculous HOA rules, and now it was time to fight back. He wasn't alone. His neighbors were talking, spreading the word, and Karen Mitchell's iron grip on the neighborhood was starting to slip. When the HOA meeting finally arrived, Daniel walked in with a sense of quiet determination. He wasn't there just for the fine. He was there to stand up for something bigger: common sense and fairness. As he took a seat at the back of the room, he could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him. Word had spread quickly about the fine, and many of them were already on his side. The meeting started, and Karen began to go over the usual agenda, reviewing minor infractions like the incorrect placement of trash bins or minor landscaping issues. But when Daniel's name came up, the atmosphere shifted. People were paying attention now. "Mr. Foster," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it seems you've ignored the HOA's parking regulations. Care to explain yourself?" Daniel stood, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the frustration he had been holding in. "I'd like to ask this board," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "if any of you think it's appropriate to fine a firefighter for parking his truck in front of his house while responding to an emergency." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's smug smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We understand that emergency services are important," Karen replied dismissively, "but we can't make exceptions." Daniel wasn't about to let it go. "You're missing the point. This isn't about parking. This is about doing what's right, about recognizing the difference between someone breaking a rule for convenience and someone doing it to save lives." The room was silent. The other members of the board exchanged glances. Karen was losing control. The tension in the HOA meeting room was palpable as Daniel stood at the front, facing down Karen Mitchell, the once unquestioned leader of the Homeowners Association. His words had already begun to shift the mood in the room. Neighbors who had been silently enduring Karen's petty enforcement of rules were beginning to speak up, murmuring their agreement with Daniel. He could feel it. Karen's grip on the neighborhood was weakening, and it was only a matter of time before it slipped completely. "We've heard Mr. Foster's concerns," Karen said, her voice icy and condescending, trying to regain control. "But the rules apply to everyone. No one is above them, not even firefighters." Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing on her. He had heard this line before, but this time he wasn't going to let it slide. "I get it, Karen," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "You're the self-appointed keeper of the rules. But these rules, they're made for a reason, to keep things in order. But you've forgotten the real reason we have rules: to help people, not punish them for doing what's right." "And I understand that," Karen shot back, "but I can't make exceptions. That's not how an HOA works. We can't bend the rules because someone feels they deserve it." Daniel took a step forward, his posture straight and his gaze unflinching. "You don't get it. It's not about deserving it. It's about saving lives. It's about recognizing that some things, like helping people escape a fire, are more important than a stupid parking rule." The room grew tense as the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was a growing murmur among the homeowners, some of them nodding in agreement with Daniel. The realization was starting to settle in. Karen wasn't just punishing Daniel, she was punishing the entire community's sense of justice and reason. "This is not just about parking," Daniel continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This is about standing up to someone who uses rules to control everyone. What happens when someone else's life is at risk? Will you still care about your stupid rules?" Karen, visibly rattled, tightened her grip on the papers in front of her, trying to maintain her authority. "We've always followed the rules, Daniel. What would happen if we didn't? What would the community become?" But Daniel wasn't done. "You know what? I'll tell you what it would become. It would become a community where we look out for each other, It would be a community where common sense trumps bureaucracy, and it would be a place where people don't fear speaking up when they're wronged, whether it's for a parking spot or anything else. The room was dead silent now. All eyes were on Karen, who was desperately trying to salvage her position. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear she was losing control. Just as Karen was about to retort, one of the board members, an older man named Tom Harris, stood up. The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to him. Tom had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now he cleared his throat and spoke up. "I've been on this board for a long time," Tom began, his voice calm but firm, "and I've seen plenty of rules enforced. But I've never seen something like this. Daniel Foster was doing his job, and I'm not sure how we can justify punishing someone who is out there saving lives." A murmur rippled through the room. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time, it felt like Karen's reign was starting to crumble. "We all know Karen runs the HOA with an iron fist," Tom continued, turning his gaze toward Karen. "But maybe it's time we rethink how we enforce these rules. Maybe it's time for us to put people before paperwork." The room shifted as more board members began to nod in agreement. Karen's face went red, and she gripped the sides of the table in frustration. "No," she snapped, her voice sharp with anger. "I've made my decision. The rules are the rules." But Tom didn't back down, and I think we need to revisit those rules. A wave of agreement swept through the room. Daniel could feel the momentum building. The community was with him now. As the board meeting continued, the atmosphere had completely shifted. What had started as a rigid defense of outdated regulations was now a full-scale rebellion against Karen's overreach. With the support of his neighbors, Daniel had exposed the flaws in the system, and Karen's power was crumbling before her eyes. It didn't take long for the vote to come. One by one, the board members cast their ballots, and the results were clear. Karen Mitchell was voted out of her position as HOA president. The moment the vote was announced, a palpable sense of relief spread across the room. Karen, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, stood up from the table, gathering her papers in a futile attempt to maintain her composure. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, but no one was listening anymore. The community had spoken, and Karen's reign of petty tyranny was over. As Karen stormed out of the room, leaving the HOA in chaos, Daniel felt a surge of triumph. He had fought for what was right, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. The vote wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every homeowner who had suffered under Karen's iron grip. The changes came quickly. The new HOA leadership, led by Tom Harris, announced reforms that would prevent future abuses of power. The ridiculous fines for minor infractions were revoked, and a new focus on fairness and community well-being replaced the rigid rule enforcement of the past. But the most significant change came when the new board introduced a policy that Daniel had fought for. First responders were granted automatic exemptions from parking violations when responding to emergencies. The rule was even unofficially named after Daniel in recognition of his heroic efforts. The community began to breathe again. The fear that had once gripped the neighborhood under Karen's rule was replaced by a renewed sense of unity. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now speaking up, no longer afraid to challenge the status quo when it didn't serve the greater good. One evening, a few weeks after the meeting, Daniel returned home to find a small envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. His stomach dropped for a second. Was it another fine? But when he opened it, he found a handwritten note from one of his neighbors, Ella Williams. "Daniel," it read, "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for what you do as a firefighter, but for standing up for all of us. We were too afraid to fight back before, but you weren't. Because of you, this neighborhood is a better place. My son won't grow up fearing the HOA anymore. We all appreciate you more than you know." Daniel smiled as he stood there in the driveway, the weight of the letter grounding him. For the first time since moving in, he felt at home, not just as a homeowner, but as part of a community that had come together for the right reasons. As he glanced at Karen's old house, now empty and put up for sale, he knew the battle wasn't just about parking. It was about standing up to tyranny, about what happens when people stop being afraid and when justice prevails over petty authority. And Daniel had won. This story proves that standing up for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can lead to real change. What would you do if you found yourself in Daniel's shoes? Would you fight for what's right, even when it seems like the system is stacked against you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can create communities built on fairness and compassion. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of courage and justice. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories and join the conversation today. When John Parker bought his dream home, he envisioned peaceful mornings with his son in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the chaos of city life. Little did he know, his dream would soon turn into a battle for his rights against an unchecked authority. Karen, the head of the local homeowners association, showed up uninvited one morning, armed with nothing but a clipboard and a demand for inspections that John never agreed to. What follows is a tense, relentless struggle that tests John's resolve to protect his home and his family from an oppressive system. This gripping story raises questions about authority, control, and the lengths individuals will go to impose their will on others. What would you do if you were in John's shoes? Would you stand up for your rights, even when it means confronting the very system meant to protect you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear from you. Stay tuned and watch till the end to discover the unexpected twists in John's fight for justice. This is a story of triumph, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of tyranny. You won't want to miss it. You've worked your whole life to buy the home of your dreams. Finally, a place where you can relax, escape the chaos, and raise your child in peace. It's a perfect home, spacious with a big backyard for your child to play in, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood far away from the noise of the city. Everything feels right. But what happens when someone steps into your life? Someone who believes they have the power to control every aspect of it. Someone who thinks they can dictate the rules of your own home? This is the harsh reality for John Parker, a father who thought he had finally found his sanctuary. His dream home quickly becomes a battleground when Karen, the head of the local homeowners association, knocks on his door one Saturday morning. Armed with nothing but a clipboard and a demand to inspect his property, Karen insists that John is now under the HOA's control. The problem? John never agreed to any of this. He never signed up for the HOA, and in fact, he's never even heard of it. What follows is a relentless struggle for John to protect his family and his peace against an individual who believes her authority is unquestionable. John's fight isn't just for his home, it's for his right to live free from someone else's idea of control. Get ready. This is a battle you won't want to miss. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden light over the quiet neighborhood. John Parker sat on his porch, savoring the rare moment of peace with a cup of coffee in hand. The fresh scent of cut grass lingered in the air from a neighbor's early landscaping, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could truly breathe. His son, Liam, was still asleep inside after a late-night movie marathon. But then, the peace was shattered. A loud, aggressive pounding on the front door made John spill coffee onto his shirt. He shot to his feet, heart racing, thinking someone might be trying to break into his home. His hand flew to the door handle, but before he could open it, a sharp, demanding voice rang out. "Open up! Homeowners Association inspection!" Confusion flooded John's mind. He'd never signed anything related to an HOA when he bought the house. The entire neighborhood seemed too quiet, too small for such an organization. What? Homeowners Association? John muttered under his breath, unlocking the door. The woman standing there was in her mid-50s, dressed sharply, her arms crossed in a stance that screamed authority. Her short, heavily styled blonde hair barely moved as she spoke with an air of entitlement that John had only seen in stories online. "Can I help you?" John asked, keeping his voice steady, but already feeling a headache brewing. The woman sized him up, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to assess whether he was worth her time. "You must be new. I'm Karen, head of the Homeowners Association board here," she said, a smug smile curling her lips. We're conducting inspections today to ensure your property complies with HOA regulations. It's all part of the rules here. You'll need to let me in." John blinked, still not quite understanding. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that applies to me. I didn't sign up for any homeowners rec association. I bought this house outright, and there was no mention of it during the purchase." Karen's face darkened instantly, her smugness slipping into irritation. "That's incorrect," she snapped, her voice sharp and cold. "Every home in this neighborhood is subject to the homeowners association regulations. Maybe your realtor forgot to mention it, but I run things here, and everyone follows the rules, whether they like it or not. Now, if you'll just step aside, I'll do a quick walkthrough." John stood his ground, not moving a single inch. "No," he said firmly, his hand pressing against the doorframe. "You're not coming in." Karen's eyes flashed with surprise, her mouth falling open slightly as she tried to regain her composure. "Excuse me?" Her voice was raised now, incredulous. "You have to comply. It's in the community guidelines. Your lawn, the exterior paint, your fence, everything needs to meet HOA standards, and I have the authority to inspect it." John let out a long breath, keeping his calm despite the mounting frustration. "Like I said, I don't have an HOA. I went through all the paperwork before moving in. This house was never under any HOA jurisdiction." Karen stepped closer, now towering in front of him with an air of superiority. "That's where you're wrong. We recently annexed several homes into the HOA, and yours is one of them. As a new member, you're already in violation of several guidelines." She waved the clipboard in front of him, as though it somehow validated her authority. "For one, your driveway has that unsightly truck parked right there. We don't allow such vehicles to be visible from the street, and I can already see your grass isn't the right length. That's a fine." John let out a bitter laugh, not believing what he was hearing. "A fine for my truck and my grass?" Karen lifted her chin in response, her voice dripping with arrogance. "That's right. And if you refuse to comply, there will be more penalties. Now, are you going to step aside, or is there going to be a problem?" The tension in the air was thick, but John took another deep breath, pushing down the anger that was rising in him. "Lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I own this house. You have no right to come in here. If you really think I'm part of your HOA, then show me the legal paperwork." Karen hesitated for a brief moment, her smug expression faltering before she regained her composure. "I'll be sending you a welcome packet with all the necessary documents," she said, her tone still condescending. "But I strongly suggest you don't make an enemy out of me. It would be very unfortunate to start off on the wrong foot with the homeowners association." John's eyes narrowed. "What exactly does that mean?" Karen smiled coldly, her voice lowering. "It means I have the power to enforce fines, restrictions, and if necessary, foreclosure. You'll soon learn that I'm in charge here." That was the breaking point for John. Without another word, he slammed the door in her face. He could hear her muttering angrily outside, but he didn't care. As he watched through the peephole, he saw her storm off, her heels clicking on the pavement with authority. John ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. He had heard the horror stories about homeowners association abuse before, but he never thought he'd be dealing with it firsthand. And worse, this woman wasn't just some annoying neighbor. She genuinely believed she had control over his home. His son, Liam, walked up behind him, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Dad, who was that?" John sighed, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Just a nosy neighbor, buddy. Nothing to worry about." But deep down, he knew that this wasn't the last time he'd see Karen. As John turned away from the door, he tried to push the irritation out of his mind. Today was supposed to be a day of relaxation, a chance to enjoy his new home. He made breakfast for Liam and tried to put the incident behind him. But in the pit of his stomach, he had a feeling this wasn't over. The day passed uneventfully, or so John hoped. He spent the morning mowing the lawn, not because of Karen's ridiculous comments, but because it needed to be done. He made small repairs inside the house, then took a moment to relax with a cold drink on the porch while Liam played in the backyard. The peaceful atmosphere, although slightly marred by the earlier encounter, was enough to help John unwind. But the calm didn't last long. Just as he was about to take a breath and enjoy a bit of silence, The unsettling sound of a vehicle pulling up in his driveway pierced the air. John's heart sank. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation, but he already knew deep down that it was coming. "Dad, who's that?" Liam called out, looking up from his game. "I don't know, buddy. Stay inside, okay?" John said, his voice steady but a knot tightening in his stomach. He opened the door slowly and peeking out through the small crack. And there she was, Karen, standing next to a man who looked as though he were uncomfortable in his own skin. He was balding, wearing a poorly fitted polo shirt, and holding a clipboard just like hers. John immediately recognized the man, Tom, the so-called treasurer of the Homeowners Association, someone he had never met but had certainly heard of now. And beside them, there was a wheelbarrow filled with bright, glaring HOA signs that made John's blood run cold. The sight felt like an invasion, an attempt to mark his property as theirs. Karen was standing confidently, clipboard raised as if she was issuing a command. Tom, on the other hand, looked almost like a man forced into a situation he wasn't sure how to handle. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" John demanded, stepping onto the porch, his voice rising in frustration. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced at him dismissively, turning back to Tom as if John wasn't even there. "Just measuring your driveway," she said matter-of-factly, crouching down and pulling out a measuring tape. "It appears to extend past Homeowners Association limits. Another violation I'll have to report." The audacity. John clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered under his breath, stepping down the porch steps toward them. "I already told you, I'm not part of your HOA. You're trespassing." Tom cleared his throat nervously, glancing at Karen for reassurance before speaking. "This is a formal warning," he said in a nasal voice, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "You have until next week to correct your violations." The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. John felt his patience snapping. "I've had enough," he said, his tone icy. "Both of you need to leave now, or I'm calling the cops." Karen didn't seem rattled in the least. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and smiled condescendingly. "Go ahead, call them. Let's see what they think about your unauthorized property modifications," she said, daring him with her words. And that was the last straw for John. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need officers sent to my address immediately," he said calmly. "I have 2 people trespassing on my property and refusing to leave. One of them is trying to enforce fake Homeowners Association rules on a house that isn't even part of their jurisdiction." He could hear the disbelief in Karen's voice as she sputtered, trying to regain control. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed, but John didn't care. The dispatcher answered, asking for details. John gave the information, making sure to stay calm despite his rising anger. "Yes, I need them removed now. I don't know what they think they're doing, but they are trespassing, and I want them gone." As he hung up, he could hear Karen muttering insults under her breath, but he wasn't paying attention anymore. John crossed his arms and leaned against the door frame, his gaze locked on the 2 intruders. He knew this wouldn't be over easily, but he wasn't about to back down. It didn't take long before he heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows as the police cruisers pulled up in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, one tall with a stern expression and the other a woman with short brown hair, surveying the situation. Karen, spotting the officers, straightened up as though she had somehow summoned them with her presence. She pointed an accusing finger at John, her voice high-pitched as she shrieked, "There, that man! He's trespassing on my property and threatened me." The officers didn't move at first, their eyes shifting between Karen and John. They seemed to be taking everything in, weighing the situation before making a decision. One of the officers, a man with sharp eyes, crouched down to Liam, who had come to the door with his father. "Hey, buddy, you all right?" he asked softly, his voice calm. Liam nodded hesitantly, gripping John's pant leg. The child was clearly scared, and John could feel his anger burn brighter at the sight of it. His voice shook with restrained fury. "I called the police. She hit my son. I want to press charges." Karen let out a forced, hollow laugh. "Oh, please, I barely touched him. He was running around where he shouldn't have been. I was teaching him some manners." She tried to justify her actions, but the desperation in her voice was obvious. The female officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Do you have proof that this property belongs to you?" she asked Karen, her tone skeptical. Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Well, not exactly," she stammered, "but—" Before she could continue, John stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "I have proof," he said calmly, swiping through the images of his purchase documents. He held the screen up, showing the legal paperwork, with his name clearly printed on it. Karen's face drained of color as she saw the proof. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flickered with anger. "That doesn't mean anything," she spat. "There are laws about homeowners association regulations. He has to comply." But the officer was already shaking her head. "What it does mean, ma'am," she interrupted, "is that John is the legal homeowner. Unless you can provide evidence stating otherwise, I suggest you stop making claims that aren't backed up by facts." Karen was at a loss for words. The female officer turned back to John. "Sir, we'll need your statement, but it looks like we have a solid case here. We'll handle this from here." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered around murmured, some of them filming the interaction on their phones, others offering quiet support to John. They'd seen enough, and now it was time for Karen's power trip to come to an end. John felt a small measure of relief as the officers prepared to take Karen away. As she was led to the squad car, she glared at him, her voice trembling with rage. "You've ruined everything. You'll regret this." John stood firm, looking down at Liam, who was still clinging to his side. "No, Karen," he muttered, his voice low but certain. "You did this to yourself." And as the police car drove away with Karen inside, John finally allowed himself to breathe. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was a victory, a step toward the peace he had been fighting for. And for the first time since moving in, he felt like he could truly relax in his own home. The next morning, John barely had time to finish his coffee when another knock echoed from the front door. His stomach twisted into a knot. He had hoped that Karen's arrest, along with the police's involvement, would be the final blow to her relentless harassment. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. He stood up and motioned for Liam to stay inside. "Stay here, buddy. I'll handle this." With a sigh, he walked toward the door and opened it cautiously, already bracing himself for another round. Standing there, nervously shifting from foot to foot, was Tom, the man who had been with Karen the previous day. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a thick envelope, which he shoved into John's hands without a word. "What's this?" John asked, narrowing his eyes at the envelope. "A formal notice," Tom stammered, adjusting his glasses as he looked everywhere but at John. "From the Homeowners Association, you've been fined for multiple violations, and you have 72 hours to comply before further action is taken." John ripped the envelope open, his heart sinking as he read the list of supposed violations written in bold, ridiculous terms. Unauthorized vehicle parked in driveway, grass height exceeding HOA standards, and even unapproved exterior modifications. Nothing that had actually changed in his home. His frustration boiled over, and he couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "This is a joke, right?" he sneered. "You people are seriously still trying this?" Tom looked uncomfortable, but tried to stand his ground. "These fines are mandatory, Mr. Parker." John shook his head, his anger rising. "No, they're not, because I'm not part of your HOA." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words left no room for argument. Tom opened his mouth, but John cut him off. "I've already checked. There's nothing in my deed that says I'm part of your so-called association. You know that, right?" Tom hesitated for a moment, clearly unsettled. We know it's been annexed. Your property is now under HOA jurisdiction." John took a step forward, his voice dropping low. "No, your little board doesn't have any jurisdiction over my property. It's a scam, and if you send me one more fake violation, I'll be suing you all for harassment and fraud. Do you understand?" The color drained from Tom's face. He glanced down at the ground, his eyes darting nervously. I'll need to speak to the board," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Without waiting for a reply, John slammed the door in his face. He leaned back against it, trying to steady his breath. This was beyond ridiculous. But as much as he wanted to throw in the towel, He knew he couldn't back down now. Karen and her cronies wouldn't stop unless they were made to. Hours later, as John sat on the porch, trying to push the stress aside, his phone buzzed. A new email flashed on the screen. Homeowners Association property line warning, immediate action required. His pulse quickened. He opened it, dreading what he would find. It was worse than he could have imagined. The email claimed that the HOA had filed a lien against his house due to unpaid violations. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a blatant attempt to take his property. The word foreclosure was even mentioned in the email. No, John muttered to himself, his hands shaking in fury. He dialed his real estate attorney immediately. The man listened to his concerns quietly, then responded with calm professionalism. "They can't do that, John," his attorney said after a pause. "I'll look into this. But for now, don't engage with them further. Forward me anything they send you." John felt a small sense of relief, but knew the fight wasn't over. Karen had been playing a dangerous game, and now, even from behind bars, she had orchestrated this entire thing. The next morning, as John was getting ready for work, a faint noise caught his attention. He looked out of the window and froze. A figure in dark clothing was standing by the back door, fiddling with the handle. His stomach dropped, and instinct kicked in. "No," he muttered, grabbing his phone. He didn't rush outside to confront them. Instead, he carefully slid his phone out of his pocket, holding it low so the camera could record the figure without being seen. He zoomed in, his heart pounding as the faint light revealed the intruder's face. It was Tom, the same man who had delivered the fraudulent fines. John had half a mind to let him break in so the police could catch him in the act. But he didn't need to do that. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and said, "There's an intruder on my property right now. They're trying to break into my house." He stayed silent as the dispatcher took the details and assured him help was on the way. Meanwhile, Tom fumbled with the door, muttering curses under his breath. But his luck had run out. A voice called out from across the street, cutting through the tension. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" John's neighbor, an older man who had been silent up until now, stood on his porch holding a shotgun, not aimed at Tom but clearly visible. "I'd take my hand off that door if I were you," the neighbor called out casually. Tom froze, his face going pale. His hands trembled as he slowly lifted them away from the door handle. The neighbor took a step closer, his voice steady. "Cops are already on their way, buddy." The sirens were almost immediate. Within moments, 2 police cruisers skidded to a halt in front of John's house. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, and Tom knew the jig was up. "Put your hands behind your back," one officer said as Tom stammered in protest. Wait, this isn't what it looks like." Tom tried to explain, but it was too late. As the officer cuffed him, Tom's eyes darted desperately toward John. She made me do it," he muttered. "Karen, she told me to scare you into compliance. I wasn't going to break in, I swear." John stared at him, arms crossed. "Then what was the plan if you got in?" Tom hesitated. "She wanted me to plant something. I don't know exactly, just enough to make sure you didn't keep fighting the HOA." The truth was coming out. John's heart sank as he realized just how far Karen and her cronies had been willing to go. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But now there was no turning back. John had everything he needed to expose them. The officers led Tom away in cuffs, and as John watched, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. This wasn't over, but with the law on his side and the truth finally revealed, John was ready for whatever came next. The fight for his home, for his peace, had only just begun. The following weeks passed with an unsettling quiet. The battle had been long and draining, but John Parker knew the war wasn't over, not yet. Even with Tom behind bars and Karen facing charges, he could feel the storm wasn't done brewing. He had fought for his home, his family, and his peace of mind, but he also knew that Karen wasn't one to let go of power so easily. Then one morning, as John sat with Liam at breakfast, the knock on the door came. He immediately knew this wasn't a casual visit. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air, and despite his earlier victories, there was always that nagging feeling that Karen would try something else. John stood up, motioning for Liam to stay seated. "Stay here, buddy," he said, trying to sound calm, but the tension was palpable. He walked toward the door, his hand tightening on the handle as he prepared for whatever was coming next. Opening the door, he was greeted by a lawyer, someone John had never seen before, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a thick file. Behind him stood a woman who looked familiar, a member of the local HOA board that he had never paid much attention to before. The lawyer wasted no time. "Mr. Parker, I'm here to inform you that we are seeking full restitution for the damages you've caused to the Homeowners Association's reputation and funds," the lawyer said, his tone smooth but laced with barely concealed threat. "We'll be filing a lawsuit unless you immediately comply with our demands." John felt his stomach twist. Was this really happening again? "What damages?" John said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You tried to illegally annex my property, falsely fined me, and even went so far as to send someone to break into my house. And now you're trying to sue me?" The lawyer pushed a thick stack of papers toward him, clearly prepared for this conversation. "We have the right to recover our losses. We are well within our legal bounds, Mr. Parker. You're in violation of community regulations. You owe us." John felt the fury bubble to the surface. It was clear they were trying to intimidate him into submission, but he wasn't going to back down. He leaned in, his voice low and firm. "I've already told you, your association has no jurisdiction over my property. If you try this again, I will sue for harassment and fraud." The lawyer blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by the sheer confidence in John's voice. "You'll regret this," the lawyer muttered before turning and walking off, clearly unable to get the upper hand. As the door shut behind him, John exhaled in relief. He glanced at Liam, who was watching from the kitchen table. "Don't worry, buddy," John said, his voice more reassuring now. "This won't be the last fight, but we're in control now. I'm going to make sure we never have to deal with them again." Days later, Karen's trial began. Her lawyer had tried to argue that she was acting under stress and in the best interests of the community. But it was clear to everyone present that this was a farce. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witnesses, Tom's confession, and the fraudulent fines. All of it was enough to shut down her scheme once and for all. When the judge handed down the verdict, Karen's face contorted in disbelief. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison for assaulting a minor, conspiracy to commit trespassing, and orchestrating a fraudulent HOA scam. As the guards took her away, she turned to glare at John. "You ruined everything," she spat, her voice filled with venom. John smiled back, not out of malice, but out of pure satisfaction. "No, Karen, you did this to yourself." But the victory didn't end there. As Karen was escorted from the courtroom, the ripple effect of her actions began to unfold. Other homeowners, some of whom had suffered at the hands of Karen's twisted HOA, began to file lawsuits. In a matter of months, the fraudulent HOA board was completely dissolved. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the collapse of the so-called community that Karen had built. Tom, desperate to save himself, turned on the remaining members of the board, revealing the years of fraudulent activity that had been hidden behind closed doors. John, with the help of the legal system, had not only protected his home, but also brought an end to a deeply corrupt system that had harmed many others. Finally, John could relax. His home was free from any HOA jurisdiction, and as he sat on his porch watching Liam play in the yard, he realized that he had won, against the HOA, against Karen, and against anyone who thought they could control him. His neighbor, the older man who had stepped in when Tom tried to break in, walked by. "You were right, John," he said with a knowing smile. "They won't stop unless you end it for good." John nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in months. "Some people think power means they can do whatever they want," he said, his voice steady. "But the only way to stop them is to remind them that they can't." And for the first time since moving in, John felt like he truly belonged. His family, his home, and his peace were his once again. What would you have done if you were in John's shoes? Do you think justice can prevail in the face of overwhelming power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We value your perspective, and your voice matters. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of justice and triumph. Stay tuned for future stories that inspire and empower, and join the conversation today. James, a homeowner, faces an escalating battle with Karen, the HOA president, over a gate he built for safety. What begins as a simple dispute quickly turns into a fight for justice and control, challenging Karen's abuse of power. As tensions rise, James must stand up not only for his property, but for the community's right to fairness. What would you do in James's shoes? Do you think Karen was justified in her actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Watch until the end to see how this thrilling story unfolds and what happens to Karen and James. It started like any other morning, but everything changed the moment I stepped outside. My eyes were still heavy from the late shift, and I was barely awake when I saw it. A bright red HOA violation notice stuck to my gate. The wind made the paper flap wildly, almost mocking me. Unauthorized gated structure. Immediate removal required. I froze, gripping the notice so tightly that the edges crinkled under my fingers. This was no mistake. I'd built that reinforced steel gate for a reason. My father, who was elderly and frail, lived with me. It wasn't just for privacy, it was for his safety. If anyone tried to break in, I needed time to get him out. Yet Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, decided it was an eyesore that had to go. What the hell was going on? For 4 years I'd lived here without so much as a complaint, but now Karen, the newly minted HOA president, was going to tear my life apart over a gate? This wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control, and she was wielding it like a weapon. I tried to keep my cool. Maybe this was just a mistake. But as I walked toward her house, I just knew, I was about to step into something far darker than I had imagined. Less than 48 hours after our tense confrontation, I got the alert. It was just after midnight, and I was jolted awake by my phone vibrating. My security camera had detected motion. Groggy and disoriented, I opened the app, my stomach sinking when I saw the live feed. Karen's SUV was parked at the end of my driveway. What the hell was she doing here? I watched in disbelief as she idled for a moment. Then suddenly her SUV lurched forward. My heart skipped a beat. Was she? No, she couldn't be. But then it happened. The engine roared to life as Karen floored it, heading straight for my reinforced steel gate. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline kicking in, pulling on a hoodie as I rushed out the front door. My mind raced. This was no accident. I had to get outside. The crash was deafening. A loud, violent thud echoed through the night as Karen's SUV slammed into the gate. I watched in horror as my steel gate barely moved, but Karen's vehicle bounced back like it had hit a concrete wall. The front bumper was crumpled, steam rising from the hood, and a car alarm blared in the distance. My breath caught as I sprinted toward the driveway, hearing my dad's groggy voice call out from his room. "James, what was that?" "Stay inside, Dad," I yelled, already charging down the driveway. By the time I reached the front of the house, Karen was already out of her SUV. She was pacing back and forth, visibly shaking with rage. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her phone. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "Are you out of your damn mind?" I shouted, stepping closer. She spun around to face me, her face red with fury. "You broke my car," she screeched, her voice high and frantic. I couldn't even process the absurdity. "I broke your car?" I scoffed. "You just tried to ram through my gate, Karen. What the hell is wrong with you?" She jabbed her finger at me, eyes blazing. "This is your fault. If you had just taken down that eyesore of a gate like I told you to, this wouldn't have happened." I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Oh, it's my fault. You're the one who tried to destroy private property, Karen. That's literally a crime." Her expression darkened, her voice turning venomous. "This is a community issue. Your gate is ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and I've had enough." I clenched my jaw, my patience slipping away. "You have no right to demand I tear it down, Karen. You're not the one who gets to make those decisions. You're not in charge of me." Karen didn't respond. Instead, she stormed over to the gate, pulling and yanking at the bars like a madwoman, clearly not understanding that the gate was locked. She was desperate, panicked even, as if she had lost all sense of reason. "Open this gate. It's a violation. You're ruining everything," she yelled, her voice becoming more and more hysterical with every second. I pulled out my phone, quickly starting to record the entire scene. I knew I had to capture this. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. "Karen, you need to leave. Now," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You're trespassing on my property." But she wouldn't stop. She kept yanking at the gate, as if her actions could somehow make the reality of the situation vanish. That's when the floodlights I had installed suddenly switched on, illuminating everything in bright, blinding light. Karen staggered back, shielding her eyes with her hand, cursing under her breath. "Turn that off!" she screamed. "No," I said, standing my ground. "I'm recording everything. I want the cameras to get a good look at you breaking the law." For a split second, I saw her face flicker with panic. She turned, her eyes darting toward the camera mounted above the gate, realizing she was caught in the act. The blood drained from her face, but she didn't give up. Instead, she turned back to her SUV, hands shaking as she fumbled with her phone, probably about to come up with some ridiculous excuse for the police. I wasn't going to wait for her to get ahead of me. I immediately dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi. Yes, I need officers at my address. Someone just tried to ram through my gate with their car and is now trespassing on my property." Karen's eyes widened as she heard me on the phone. She took a step toward me, her voice turning syrupy sweet. Wait, she said, trying to backpedal. "Let's not get the police involved. We can handle this like adults." I raised an eyebrow. "Like how? By destroying my property and making threats?" She swallowed hard, but it was too late. She was already trapped, and I had the evidence to prove it. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as Karen fidgeted, glancing nervously between me and the approaching police. Her face, once filled with smug confidence, had drained of color. It was a beautiful thing to witness. The very same woman who tried to tear my life apart was now trembling under the weight of her own reckless actions. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars skidded to a halt in front of my house. The officers stepped out, their eyes taking in the scene, the wrecked SUV, Karen's frantic pacing, and the still intact gate that had absorbed her crash like a brick wall. One of the officers, a tall, no-nonsense man with graying hair, looked at me first. "You all right, sir?" he asked, his voice steady. I nodded, pointing toward Karen. She tried to ram through my gate. My cameras caught the whole thing. I gestured to the security feed on my phone, now playing the footage of Karen's SUV charging toward the gate and crashing into it. The younger officer, a smaller man with a sharp jawline, pulled out a notebook. "All right, ma'am," he said, turning to Karen. "What happened here?" Karen's eyes flared with something close to panic, and she marched right up to the older officer, practically waving her arms in desperation. "Officers, thank God you're here," she cried, playing the victim card. "This man is harassing me. He's built this illegal monstrosity of a gate, and now he's refusing to take it down. It's ruining the entire neighborhood." I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to snap. "She's lying," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That gate is legal. I have all the permits. She tried to destroy my property, and now she's trying to turn this around on me." The younger officer glanced at the footage and raised an eyebrow. "So just to clarify, you deliberately drove into his gate?" he asked, flipping through his notebook. Karen's face twitched. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. She swallowed, then mumbled, "I was just enforcing HOA regulations. This gate is an eyesore, and it's ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic." The older officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, you don't drive your car into someone's property because you don't like the way it looks. You've just admitted to property damage." He looked at the younger officer, who nodded and scribbled something down. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Karen's face twisted with rage, and for a moment I thought she might explode. But then, in a fit of defiance, she turned on me again. "This is all your fault. You provoked me with that ugly gate. You're the one who's ruined the neighborhood." I couldn't believe the audacity. "You're the one who tried to destroy my property, Karen." I shot back, my voice rising. "And now you're going to pay the price for it. You don't just get to walk away from this." The officers exchanged a look before the older one addressed Karen again, his voice cold and firm. "Ma'am, we have security footage of you deliberately driving into his property and attempting to trespass. You're under arrest for attempted property damage and trespassing." Karen's face drained of all color. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. But there was nothing she could say that would get her out of this. "No, you can't do this," she shrieked, her voice high-pitched with panic. I have rights. I'm just doing my job as HOA president. The younger officer grabbed her arm, securing it in handcuffs. You've broken the law, ma'am, he said, his voice laced with impatience. You're not above the law, no matter what position you hold. Karen fought against the cuffs, her face contorted in pure fury. You don't understand. I'm protecting the neighborhood. This man's gate. She was cut off by the officer tightening the cuffs as they led her to the patrol car. I stood there watching her being hauled away, unable to suppress a small smirk. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The woman who had terrorized me for so long was finally being held accountable for her actions. I looked at the officers as they climbed into their cars. Thanks, I said quietly. I appreciate you handling this. The older officer nodded. We've got you covered, sir. Just stay safe from now on. As the police cars drove away, I stood in the driveway, the floodlights still casting harsh shadows over everything. I looked at my damaged gate and then back at Karen's wrecked SUV. It was over, for now. But I knew this wouldn't be the last I'd see of Karen. If there was one thing I'd learned about her, it was that she wouldn't go down without a fight. And the next round was already on the horizon. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars slowly faded as they pulled away, and the night seemed to settle back into an uneasy silence. I stood in my driveway, staring at the wreckage of Karen's SUV, my mind racing. For a brief moment, I thought I could finally breathe easy. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, especially not after this. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, the quiet of the neighborhood felt like a calm before a storm. I half expected to see some kind of retaliation, but nothing came, at least not immediately. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I saw the familiar red and white violation notice taped to my gate. My stomach dropped when I read it. Emergency HOA ruling. All homeowners with private gates must have them inspected by the HOA board within 48 hours or face fines or forced removal. I stood there, staring at the paper in disbelief. My heart pounded. How was she still pulling strings after everything that happened? The woman had literally just been arrested for attempted property damage, and now she was back at it, using her power to harass me once again. I stormed over to the HOA office, my mind already racing through the possibilities. I opened the door, and there she was, Karen, sitting at the front desk, wearing a crisp suit and sipping coffee like she hadn't just spent the night in a police car. The audacity! She glanced up when I entered, her lips curling into that infuriating smile of hers. Oh, James, back so soon? Didn't take long for you to come to terms with reality. I felt my blood boil as I walked up to her. What the hell is this? I slapped the violation notice onto the desk, my voice low but seething with anger. Karen casually leaned back in her chair, taking a sip from her mug before answering. Oh, didn't you hear? After last night's unfortunate incident, the HOA board has decided to take action. We simply can't allow your gate to remain up without inspection. You know, it's for the community. I fought to keep my voice steady, but my fists clenched at my sides. You're still pulling this crap? After everything that's happened? She just smiled. It's not about personal vendettas, James. It's about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. You really should have thought about that before you built that monstrosity. I was done trying to reason with her. I was done letting her bully me, letting her twist the rules to her advantage. But I needed something more than just my anger. I needed leverage. I needed a way to fight back. I left the office, my mind racing. As soon as I got home, I pulled out the binder I'd been quietly assembling over the last few months. Every complaint, every violation, every shady move Karen had made while in charge of the HOA. I flicked through the pages until I found what I was looking for. A clause buried deep in the HOA's bylaws. There it was, in black and white. Any new rule or regulation affecting homeowners' properties must be approved by a community-wide vote. Karen had skipped that step entirely. She had forced the inspection rule through, thinking no one would question it. She thought she could just wave her hand and get her way. I smirked. She had just handed me the perfect weapon to destroy her. The next morning, I started knocking on doors. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I wasn't going to back down, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her push me around. The first house I visited was the Johnsons. They were longtime residents, quiet and respectful, but Karen had fined them $200 last year for a garden decoration. I explained the situation to Mrs. Johnson, and her eyes immediately hardened. "Count us in," she said, signing the petition. Her husband, a usually soft-spoken man, nodded silently but firmly. Next, I visited the Patels, who'd been fined $50 by Karen for leaving their trash bins out too long. They were more than happy to add their signatures to my growing list. By the end of the day, I had over 30 signatures, more than enough to challenge Karen's inspection rule and force a real vote. But I didn't stop there. I knew I needed more. I needed to expose Karen's manipulation, to show the entire neighborhood who she really was. So I did something she never expected. I turned to social media. I created a Facebook group titled HOA Reform, Taking Back Our Community, and within hours, it exploded. People started sharing their horror stories, how Karen had fined them for trivial things, how she'd bullied them into submission, how she'd used the HOA board to control every aspect of their lives. Within 24 hours, the group had over 100 members. Karen's reign of terror was unraveling, and she didn't even know it. I couldn't help but smile as I clicked post on my official challenge to the HOA board. I cited the exact bylaws Karen had ignored in forcing the inspection rule through. Now the board had no choice but to schedule a formal vote on it. When Karen found out, she lost it. I was outside watering my lawn when I heard her heels clicking against the pavement. I turned just in time to see her storming toward me, her clipboard in one hand, her face twisted with rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed, stopping right in front of me. I didn't flinch. "Actually, Karen, I know I am." Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "You had no right to challenge my authority. You have no idea who you're messing with." I laughed, low and taunting. "Actually, Karen, I think I do. Didn't you say that last night, just before you got arrested?" Her face turned crimson with fury, but she said nothing. She stormed off, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew her time was running out. This was the beginning of the end for Karen, and she had no idea what was coming next. After weeks of mounting tension, legal battles, and hidden agendas, the day of the HOA vote had finally arrived. I stood outside my house, staring at my gate, the very same gate that had caused so much chaos, so many sleepless nights, and so much unnecessary conflict. A gate that had become more than just a physical barrier. It had become a symbol of everything Karen had tried to take from me, my privacy, my rights, and my peace of mind. But today, it would be more than just a battle for my gate. It was about taking back control, standing up for what was right, and making sure no one like Karen could ever wield unchecked power again. As I entered the community center where the vote would take place, I could feel the weight of the moment. The room was packed with residents, some who had signed my petition, others who were there out of curiosity. And then there was Karen, sitting at the front, her arms crossed, her usual smug smile plastered across her face. She was completely convinced that she had won this battle. I walked up to the front and stood quietly, waiting for the vote to begin. The air in the room felt thick, as if everyone could sense the importance of what was about to happen. I glanced around the room and saw a few familiar faces. Mrs. Johnson, the Patels, the Wongs, people who had all stood by me through this insane ordeal. The HOA president, the man who had replaced Karen after her arrest, stood up to call the meeting to order. "All right, everyone," he began. "Today we're here to vote on the new regulation regarding the inspection of private gates, specifically the one at James' property." Karen's eyes narrowed, and I could see the tension in her posture. She knew what was coming. "We'll proceed with the vote now," the president said, looking around the room. "All those in favor of keeping the current inspection rule in place, raise your hand." A few hands went up, mostly from the people who were still under Karen's influence, but not enough to pass the rule. Now those against the inspection rule? The hands that went up were unanimous. My supporters, the people who had finally seen Karen for who she truly was. Karen's face went pale, her lips tightening into a thin line. She knew she had lost. The vote was over before it even started. She had no power here anymore. I could see the anger building in her eyes. She stood up abruptly, slamming her palms onto the table. "This is outrageous. You can't just let him get away with this. I've worked too hard for this community." Her voice was shrill, her eyes wild with panic. Actually, Karen, I said, standing up calmly, you've done nothing but terrorize this neighborhood for far too long, and it ends today. I felt the weight of the room shift as the residents stared at Karen. The facade was cracking, and her once iron grip on the HOA was slipping away. I had the votes, the support, and the truth on my side. Karen had nothing left but her empty threats. She turned to me, her face twisted in fury. You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. You have no idea who you're messing with. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. Oh, I think I do, Karen. I think I've known all along. Karen's hands were trembling, her composure completely shattered. She stood there, staring at me for a long moment, her face burning with resentment. You'll regret this, she spat, before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. As the door slammed, the room erupted into applause. People were cheering, clapping, even shaking my hand as they passed by. It was as if a weight had been lifted from all of us. We were free from the oppressive grip of someone who had used power for selfish gain. The HOA president called for a vote to officially remove Karen from her position, and the motion passed without any opposition. Just like that, she was out. The community was moving forward, and we were no longer going to be bullied into submission, a physical barrier. It had become a symbol of resilience. It represented everything I had fought for, the right to protect my family, to stand up for myself, and to not let someone like Karen have the power to control my life. As I watched the for sale sign go up in front of Karen's house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She was gone, and with her, the toxic influence she had cast over this neighborhood. The community was finally free to rebuild, to heal from the damage she had caused. The street seemed quieter, calmer now. There was no longer the constant undercurrent of tension, no more whispered conversations about Karen's next move or how she might be trying to manipulate things behind the scenes. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I turned away from the gate and looked around at the neighborhood. My neighbors were out, some chatting on their porches, others walking their dogs, and for the first time, it felt like we were truly a community again, one that had stood up and fought back and had come out stronger on the other side. After weeks of tension, James' fight for justice finally pays off. With the support of his community, he exposes Karen's abuse of power and secures a victory that restores fairness and freedom to the neighborhood. Karen's reign is over, and James's gate stands as a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. What do you think of James' journey? Do you believe the community made the right decision? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about standing up to injustice. HOA Karen tried to take my property, so I built a 20-foot wall in revenge. Tom's peaceful life in his new home quickly turned into a battle for his rights when Karen, the overbearing HOA president, tried to take away part of his backyard. What began as a simple dispute soon escalated into a full-blown war when Tom built a 20-foot wall in defiance of her control. As the situation intensified, Tom's actions became a symbol of resistance, capturing the attention of his neighbors and the city. Do you think Tom's decision to build the wall was justified, or was it an overreaction to HOA rules? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to watch the full story to see how this conflict unfolds and whether Tom's stand changes everything for the neighborhood. Tom had just moved into his new home in a quiet neighborhood, thinking that he had finally escaped the noise of the city. The backyard was spacious, peaceful, and perfect for the garden he had been planning for a long time. He envisioned himself sitting back on the porch, sipping lemonade, living the dream life of a family man. But that dream shattered the moment Karen showed up at his door. Tom had heard of Karen before, the kind of neighbor who always thinks the world revolves around her, but he didn't expect to meet someone like her so soon. Karen wasn't just an ordinary neighbor. She was a force to be reckoned with. A middle-aged woman with a fairly full figure and shoulder-length golden brown hair. She always wore a black suit, looking like she had just stepped out of a corporate meeting rather than a casual conversation with a neighbor. But it was clear that her appearance radiated power and she believed she had the right to control everything. "I'm sorry to inform you," Karen began, her voice full of confidence, "but part of your backyard doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the HOA, community property." Tom stared at her as if she had just told him he won the lottery, but with the fine print saying, "But now we're taking it back." "That's definitely not how it works," he replied, feeling irritation begin to rise. "Oh, but it does," Karen retorted. "The HOA is always right." And so Tom was introduced to the suburban nightmare that would change his life in the months to come. And if he had to fight, he wouldn't let Karen get away with it. Who would be afraid of a Karen in a black suit with a clipboard in hand? Since the HOA meeting, things had taken a turn for the worse very quickly. Tom had prepared himself for legal battles, but Karen's actions were far beyond what he had imagined. After a few days, he received unreasonable violation notices from the HOA. "Your garden doesn't meet the standards." A reason that left him dumbfounded, as his garden was always neatly trimmed like a picture-perfect landscape. But no, the HOA claimed he was doing it wrong, even though anyone could clearly see that it was perfect. Then came another warning about his outdoor chairs not being in compliance. The simple, cute set of chairs Tom had bought just to enjoy his mornings was now under scrutiny by the HOA and subjected to a fine for being inadequate design. Tom sat there shocked, staring at the chair Karen called a community obstruction, and wondered if anyone in this neighborhood knew how to sit on a chair properly. Every time Tom opened his door to get the mail, he wondered, what am I going to get fined for this time? For having a swing in the garden? For trees growing in the wrong direction? Or for the roof color not being correct enough? Tom thought, feeling ridiculous. It felt like every time he breathed, Karen could find a reason to issue a fine. But this time, things were different. This time, Tom had enough evidence, and he was determined not to let Karen get away with her antics anymore. But he didn't just want to protest through paperwork. He needed a more powerful move. After sitting and thinking for hours, searching for any way to make Karen eat her words, Tom came up with a crazy idea, but it might just be the only way to deal with Karen. He would not only defend his land, but he would make sure Karen would never dare step foot on it again. "That's it!" Tom said to himself as he came up with the perfect plan. A wall. Not a tiny fence like others build. A wall, 20 feet high. But he knew this was a delusional idea, and it would definitely attract a lot of attention in the neighborhood. But that didn't matter. He could already hear Karen's laughter echoing in the distance. And if she thought he would easily back down, she was wrong. Tom started looking into building regulations in the area. Surely there's some loophole in the city regulations that I can exploit, he thought. After researching the wall height regulations, he discovered some good news. In the backyard area, there were no height restrictions for structures as long as they didn't affect public utilities. Tom's mood at that moment could be described as crazy happy. He had the permit to build a 20-foot wall without breaking the law. Not only that, but Tom also thought that if he was going to do this, he might as well make it impressive, a truly remarkable wall. Without wasting any time, he hired a construction team and began preparing for his great project. He joked with the construction crew, "You guys are going to feel like you're building a fortress, right?" Mike, one of the workers, looked at Tom with confusion. "Did you say you're building something like a fortress? Are you serious?" Tom nodded with a determined expression. "If Karen wants war, we'll give her a proper one." Despite Mike shaking his head and chuckling, the construction team got to work. Not long after, a giant truck loaded with concrete slabs and steel reinforcements arrived at Tom's yard. As the wall began to rise, Tom felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Every brick felt like a statement, every layer of cement a step forward in the fight. It didn't take long for Karen to find out. Just a few hours into the construction, she stormed in, walking quickly like a whirlwind, her eyes filled with fury. "What the hell is this?" Karen shouted, pointing at the wall being built. Tom calmly sat on the porch, sipping his coffee, and replied, "Oh, just a little home improvement project, Karen." Karen turned red with anger, holding the HOA regulation paper, but she could do nothing but stand there and watch the wall grow taller. "You can't do this! This violates HOA policies." Sorry, but according to city regulations, I'm not doing anything wrong. You can review the city laws if you want, Tom responded with a light smile. Karen was so angry she couldn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked away. But Tom knew this story was far from over. However, at least this wall would be the first mark in the unrelenting fight he was about to begin. Tom's wall construction was progressing rapidly. In the early days, he felt like a king building his castle, with every brick carefully laid and every steel column reinforced firmly. As the days went by, the wall grew taller and taller, drawing increasing attention from the neighborhood residents. Some even stood outside the fence, applauding his courage. But Karen, unable to sit idly by, began rallying the full force of the HOA board. As soon as she saw the towering wall, she couldn't keep her composure any longer. One day, as she was inspecting the project, she suddenly appeared, her eyes sparkling with fury. "Tom, what on earth do you think you're building?" Karen shouted, her voice full of anger. "What do you think you're doing? This is a residential area, not a fortress." Tom stood firm, leaning against a concrete column, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Oh, Karen, it's just a little home improvement project. If you don't like it, feel free to check with the city to see if there's any regulations stopping me." Karen stormed up, slamming the HOA regulation paper on the table, her eyes sharp as daggers. This is the rule. This wall is a serious violation. The HOA won't let this slide." Tom remained unfazed, shrugging casually. "Sorry, but you might want to review the city regulations. All the permits and paperwork are in order. You can't stop me." Karen took a deep breath, struggling to contain her fury. "You think you're going to win this? The HOA can make your life here a living hell. I'll report this to the city. I'll sue you, and there will be severe consequences for you." Tom straightened up, his smile calm yet confident. "If you want war, we'll have war. But remember, I've done my homework, and I'm not doing anything wrong." As the days passed, the situation grew increasingly tense. Karen didn't stop trying to sabotage the project. One morning, Tom woke up to find the construction sign had been removed, along with an official notice from the city. The project must cease immediately, it said. But Tom didn't pay much attention to it, knowing the city couldn't stop him as long as everything was properly documented. One weekend morning, while Tom was enjoying a cup of coffee on his porch, a group from the HOA unexpectedly showed up, led by Karen and a few other board members. They stood before the wall, staring at it as if facing a great threat. Unable to contain herself, Karen charged straight at Tom. "Listen up, Tom. This is your last warning. If you don't stop this construction immediately, we'll sue you and demand you tear down the wall." Tom calmly looked at her, not even bothering to look up from the newspaper he was reading. "Oh? And you think you'll win? I've done everything by the book, so don't think you can scare me." Another board member, Mr. Roger, spoke up. "Tom, maybe we don't agree with the way you're doing this, but we don't want to escalate things further. Let's just leave it be. You don't need to go this far." Tom turned to look at Mr. Roger, offering a slight, knowing smile. "You don't agree? But you stay silent when Karen here is tormenting me. That's right, everyone knows who she is." Karen immediately snapped back, her voice nearly exploding. "You think you're clever? You have no idea about the power of the HOA. I've been doing this for years. Don't think you can just defeat me this easily." Tom took a step forward toward Karen, looking her straight in the eyes, his voice cold. "You've abused your power for too long, and now it's time for you to pay. People are watching, and they're not afraid of you anymore." The tension among the board members was palpable. Some exchanged furtive glances, but no one dared speak out in support of Karen. Tom wasn't just standing up against an individual, he was fighting for the entire community. A few days after the wall was completed, Tom received a letter. Not a party invitation or a congratulatory note, but a court notice informing him that Karen had officially filed a lawsuit against him. Tom's expression didn't change, and he wasn't the least bit fazed. Karen wasn't giving up, and this time she was taking the case to the highest level to crush everything. But Tom had prepared. Not only did he have solid evidence, but he had also gathered proof of every instance where Karen had abused her power. He knew that this was the moment, and it was his opportunity to end it all. Not only would he protect his land, but he would also make Karen pay for her malicious actions. The day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. As Tom entered the courtroom, he felt not just the cold chill of the room, but the immense pressure of the lawsuit. Karen was already there, sitting smugly, as if she knew she was going to win. But her smugness quickly faded when she saw Tom standing firm, calm, and collected. Tom walked up to the stand and looked Karen in the eye without hesitation. "Karen," he said, his voice echoing in the courtroom, "you can't keep abusing your power. Not anymore. I've prepared all the evidence, documents, and testimonies proving the wrongdoing you've committed. You will pay for this." Tom's words were like a slap to Karen's face, making her unable to sit still. The entire courtroom fell silent, as if waiting for Tom's next words. And as Tom finished his statement, his cold stare swept over the room, as if delivering a clear declaration of war. It didn't take the court long to deliver a verdict. The light of justice shone through, and Tom, with his persistence and careful preparation, emerged victorious. Karen didn't just lose, she was also heavily penalized for her abuse of power and illegal actions over the years. Not only that, but the HOA, the organization she had manipulated and tormented so many people with, was also dissolved. Tom stood there, taking a deep breath. It wasn't out of arrogance, but because he had truly protected his rights and his family. He hadn't just regained his land, but he had also helped the community break free from Karen and the HOA's tyranny. After the court ruled in his favor, Tom walked out of the courtroom feeling much lighter. He no longer felt the pressure, no longer felt the anxiety that had loomed over his life for so long. Tom had won. Not just a lawsuit, but a victory in the fight for his own rights, the rights of his family, and for the community that had been oppressed under Karen's rule. Karen, with her angry and defeated face, sat silently in the courtroom. But soon after, she was forced to leave, her life now in ruins. The title of powerful HOA president that Karen had once been proud of was now just a distant memory. She couldn't help but realize that the power she once had was shattered by Tom, and perhaps she would have to live with that humiliation for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, life in Tom's neighborhood returned to peace. The community was no longer living in fear, no longer suffering from the unreasonable rules and baseless threats from the HOA. The residents, who had once been silent out of fear, began to speak up, sharing their stories of Karen's abuse of power. They felt liberated, and for the first time in a long time, they could live freely, no longer under control. And the wall, the massive wall Tom had built not only to protect his land, but to fight against oppression, had become a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of courage. An indelible symbol. People started calling it the Wall of Freedom, and gradually, it became an unmissable landmark in the neighborhood. Day by day, the neighborhood changed. People grew more united. They shared their stories of being mistreated by Karen and the HOA, and this change didn't just happen overnight. The residents, no longer afraid, started making small improvements to their homes without needing HOA approval. Families began taking care of their gardens in their own way, creating a beautiful and free living space. Then one day, a group of students approached Tom with a bold idea. They wanted to paint a massive mural on the wall, a mural not just reflecting resistance, but also honoring the values of freedom and rights. After some consideration, Tom agreed, and within weeks, the wall became a vibrant work of art, featuring Karen, now depicted as an angry cartoon character, with Tom standing beside her, arms wide like a hero. Large letters appeared. "Never let a HOA Karen win." The mural became a powerful symbol, and soon after, the park around the wall began to attract many visitors. People from other neighborhoods, from distant cities, started coming to admire the Wall of Freedom. Tom couldn't believe that his crazy decision had made such a huge impact. The park had become a famous tourist spot, with visitors coming to take pictures, share their stories, and celebrate rights and freedom. One beautiful morning, as Tom was cleaning up in front of his house and gazing at the legendary wall, he received a letter from the city council. At first, he thought it was just a typical notice about taxes or some administrative issue, but when he opened it, he could hardly believe his eyes. The city government wanted to buy his land and turn it into an official public park. They offered him a significant sum for it, and even wanted to rename the park Karen's Memorial Park, the Freedom Park. Tom sat down, smiling softly. He had fought, and now he was receiving an unexpected reward. Though the money was tempting, Tom knew that this park and his wall were not for sale. He had won for the right reasons, and nothing could change that. No, I'm not selling, Tom decided. Instead, I want to turn it into a public space where everyone can come freely, participate, and experience it. And on the sign, I will inscribe a message: never let a HOA Karen win. What do you think of Tom's ultimate victory? Was it a triumph for individual rights, or just an unfortunate escalation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like Tom's. When HOA and Karen took over my land, I fought back in court and won. I have always loved this land, where my family has lived for generations. Every time I return from a long business trip, I always feel an indescribable joy because I know I will return to a peaceful place with fields of wheat stretching green and lush. However, after a business trip to Japan, where I had to work for a month to help a company with market development consulting, I never expected that this return would mark the biggest change in my life. The afternoon sunlight shone down, and I saw a sight I never expected. A massive concrete block stood tall before me. A three-story hotel with a shiny facade like a giant creature reaching up amid the wheat fields that I had once tended to. The glass panels reflected the sunlight like thousands of eyes watching me. A heavy feeling overwhelmed me. This was no longer my land. The familiar, warm landscape was now just a symbol of intrusion and takeover. I felt a tightness in my chest, an uncomfortable sensation as if I couldn't breathe. I stopped the car right on the gravel road. It felt like my heart was racing, not out of fear, but because of the anger building up inside me. A part of me wanted to turn around, drive away quickly, and forget everything, but I couldn't. This was my family's legacy. This was the place that raised me. I couldn't let a massive concrete block replace all the memories and hard work that my family had put into this land. I couldn't stand there doing nothing. With every passing second, my anger grew stronger. Standing there, watching that construction grow larger before my eyes, I felt like I was losing everything. How could I let someone else take the land my family had kept for generations? I decided to face this right away. Despite the surprise and discomfort I felt, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the construction site. The workers in protective gear walked back and forth, but none of them seemed to pay attention to me. I stopped in front of one worker standing near a signboard, looking at him with determination. I needed to clarify everything right now. "This is my family's land," I said, my voice not loud but powerful, showing calmness and determination. "I'm Michael Adams, the owner of this land." The worker looked at me, a little surprised, then quickly took a step back. "You're the owner?" he asked, his voice somewhat surprised but also uncomfortable. I could sense that he didn't know how to handle this situation. I didn't respond immediately, instead glancing at the signboard nearby. A name stood out clearly: Karen Mitchell, HOA president. Everything suddenly became clearer than ever. Memories of her sending letters complaining about the unpainted fence, the height of the grass not meeting regulations, and constant reminders about not following HOA rules flooded back. Karen had always found ways to put my family in difficult situations, but I never thought she would go this far. The land, this land, had long become something she wanted to take for herself. When I looked back at the sign, I could feel the coldness in her handwriting, as if she had completely taken ownership of everything here. There was no doubt now, this was Karen's doing. She had wanted to seize this land for a long time, but I never imagined she would take such drastic action. And now, this was the moment I had to face what I had let slip away all this time. As I stood facing the massive hotel, the anger and disappointment slowly turned into determination. This land was more than just property to me. It was the place my family had been rooted in for so many years, where my ancestors had worked and cared for every inch of soil. The memories of early mornings, when I worked the fields with my father, or the nights spent gathered around the family hearth, remained vivid in my mind. This wasn't just land. It was everything my family had built, our legacy to pass down to future generations. But now, a massive concrete structure was taking over that land. I couldn't just stand still and watch this intrusion. My resolve grew stronger as I remembered the times Karen Mitchell, the president of the HOA, had sent complaint letters about trivial things like the height of the grass or the fence that hadn't been repainted, things that seemed insignificant to her, but to me, they were violations of my family's property rights. She had always tried to present herself as a serious community manager, but her actions always had a clear agenda. Karen's goal wasn't just to make the HOA perfect, it was to take over this land. And I started to realize she had gone too far. I couldn't let this happen again. I began thinking about ways to deal with it, and the help of Emily was exactly what I needed right now. She always had a sharp eye for detail and would definitely help me analyze everything accurately. I picked up my phone and sent her a message. "There's an emergency. Call me ASAP." The emptiness I had felt inside began to subside as I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. As soon as I got back into the car, I felt a surge of urgency. I couldn't just let things unfold without taking action. I began digging through old family documents, those that my grandfather had carefully kept for years. I clearly remembered him saying, "Knowledge is the most powerful weapon." These documents were not just old scraps of paper. They were invaluable evidence. With Emily by my side, we began going through the maps, meeting minutes, and letters my grandfather had both received and sent. Gradually, I realized these papers not only helped me understand the land my family owned, but also exposed the tricks HOA had used over the years. One map drawn by my grandfather in 1952 caught my attention. It meticulously outlined the boundaries of our land, with lines and notes that revealed a thorough preparation, a long-term plan to protect this property. These documents weren't just a legacy. They were weapons for me to fight for my rights. That map confirmed that this land could not be altered or seized without my family's consent. Then I discovered more documents, HOA meeting minutes, exchanges between HOA members and local authorities. All of them pointed to a tight connection between Karen and local real estate developers. In fact, I began to realize that the actions of HOA over the years were not random. This was a calculated strategy, and now I knew I had to fight, not only to reclaim my land, but also to stand against the wrongful decisions they had made in the shadows. When I walked into my office, the light from the small window shone in, but all I could think about was one thing: how to fight back against Karen Mitchell and HOA. I could feel the tension in every step, knowing that the documents I had gathered over the past few days were now the weapons I needed to use carefully. Each piece of paper, every map, every meeting minutes were not just worthless items, but powerful evidence to expose the shady actions of HOA and Karen. Emily had helped me organize these documents, sorting them by categories. She had a sharp eye, and as we reviewed each piece of the puzzle together, I could feel the tension and determination rising within me. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, for my family, and for what rightfully belonged to me. Karen thought she could take everything from me without facing resistance, but she was wrong. With Emily's help, I began reaching out to a few people in the community who could support me in this fight. One of them was David Parker, a lawyer I had researched through local friends. David was tough and smart, and I felt reassured when he agreed to help me. From the very first meeting, he understood the situation and provided invaluable legal advice. David wasn't just a lawyer. He had experience in land disputes. He helped me build a detailed legal strategy, step by step. We weren't just going to rebut HOA's evidence, but we were also going to point out the weaknesses in their file. Together with the documents from my grandfather, we would prove that HOA and Karen's actions were not only legally wrong, but also violated my family's fundamental rights. Every time David and I discussed, I felt my confidence grow. Just as my grandfather had said, knowledge is the most powerful weapon. As this battle began to unfold, I realized something important. This wasn't just my fight. It was the fight of the entire community. Neighbors started coming to me, sharing their own stories about how Karen and HOA had made life difficult for them. Some had been afraid to speak out, but now they saw an opportunity to stand up against those who abused their power. The more people from the community joined the fight, the more I felt I was no longer alone. And that was my greatest strength. With the support of Emily, David, and the community around me, I felt the power of a strategy built on evidence, testimonies, and a sense of fairness. I started to realize that this fight wouldn't just be a personal one. It would become a struggle for the rights of all the residents in the area, those who had been threatened by the abuse of power and influence. That realization pushed me to keep fighting, not just to protect my family, but to protect justice within the community. After getting everything ready, David Parker, my lawyer, and I began crafting a strategy for the direct confrontation with Karen Mitchell and HOA. This was no longer just about land ownership. This was a fight to protect my family from the abuse of power by people like Karen. David had reviewed the documents I found, and we decided to organize an official meeting to demand that Karen and the HOA members explain their actions, particularly the construction of the hotel on my family's land without consent. As I entered the meeting room, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression like a wolf waiting for its prey. The HOA members looked at me with cautious glances, as if I were the one causing a disturbance. I didn't feel pressured. The documents and evidence I brought with me had been prepared for a long time, and now was the time to fight for justice. "Hello, Mr. Adams," Karen spoke, her tone sharp and filled with disdain. "I think you'll understand that this project has been approved, and it's a major step forward for our area. This will benefit the community greatly." I didn't hesitate to interrupt her. "This isn't about the community, Karen. It's about your personal interests and those of your colleagues in the HOA. I don't care about your development projects. I only care about how you violated my family's legal ownership." Karen tried to remain calm, but I could sense the tension in her eyes. She began flipping through the documents as though nothing was wrong. "You're misunderstanding this, Mr. Adams. This is a decision that was approved by the city government. We can't stop just because of a few trivial requests." "You can't stop because you think you have the right. But you've forgotten that my family's rights are protected by the law," I replied, my voice firm. "I have enough evidence to prove that everything you've done is illegal. What you're saying is just an excuse to cover up your greed." I pulled out my grandfather's old map from 1952, detailing the boundaries of our land, and placed it on the table in front of Karen. "This is our evidence. My family has owned this land for generations, and you have no right to change that." Karen looked at the map, trying to maintain her composure, but I could see her beginning to hesitate. My words were clearly not easy for her to brush off. She knew well that I wasn't an easy opponent, and these documents were powerful weapons in this fight. "You think that with an old map you can change everything?" Karen tried to speak, but her voice wasn't as certain as before. "It's not just an old map, Karen. This is my family's history. It's a legal right that you cannot violate, and I won't let you or the HOA do so without facing legal consequences," I replied, unwavering. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. HOA members started exchanging nervous glances. I could feel that subtle but important change. Michael Adams, the simple farmer they once thought could be easily pushed around, was standing up and fighting back with everything he had. The confrontation in the meeting room grew more intense. I had presented strong evidence, and there was no room for avoidance anymore. Karen continued flipping through the documents, but I could clearly see the worry in her eyes. My words were no longer easy for her to ignore, as she once thought. It felt like every word I said was a direct blow to her arguments. "You can't just turn this around because of these documents," Karen said, her voice weaker now. "We have the approval from the government. Everything is legitimate. You can't change that with just a few pages." "I'm not changing anything," I responded, my eyes never leaving hers. "I just want you to understand that what you and the HOA are doing is wrong, and I will not let this continue without resistance." The room fell silent. Karen seemed to start feeling the pressure, and she could no longer deny the truth. The HOA members began exchanging glances, and those who had once been complicit with Karen now seemed to have some doubts. This gave me the feeling that I could maintain the upper hand in this confrontation. Karen looked at me again, trying to maintain her confidence. "You won't win this, Mr. Adams. We followed the correct procedures. Then can you explain why you never informed my family about the land zoning changes?" I asked. Can you explain why we never received a meeting notice or an official announcement from the HOA regarding this project? Karen didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her eyes full of unease. This was a clear sign that she knew she could no longer justify her actions. My challenge had made her uneasy. Finally, Karen sighed and lowered her voice. "I think we'll need more time to review everything," she said, trying to regain her composure. "Let's let this meeting continue, and we'll make a decision afterward." I didn't answer right away, but simply stared at her for a moment. I knew this wasn't the end, but at least I had made one thing clear. This fight wouldn't be easy for Karen and the HOA. I had forced them to confront the truth and start questioning what they had done. "We'll see, Karen," I replied, not forgetting to look at her with determination. "I won't stop until everything is resolved fairly." After the tense confrontation with Karen Mitchell, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. What mattered now wasn't just a legal battle, but building collective strength, a powerful support force from the community. If I wanted to win, I needed the support of those who had been oppressed by the HOA, those who had witnessed Karen and the HOA's manipulation and injustice. I decided to hold a meeting with the residents in the area, especially those who had suffered from the HOA's oppression in the past. This wasn't just a regular gathering. It was an opportunity for the community and me to share our stories, assert our rights, and stand together to fight against the abuse of power. This meeting would be a turning point where people could better understand the schemes of Karen and the HOA and build a strong force to rise up for justice. That evening, I invited everyone who could participate and share their story to a small cafe in the area. The space was cozy but tense as people started to gather. Mr. Henderson, my longtime neighbor, was the first to arrive. He was a simple but strong man, having lived in this area for many years, and was one of the first to feel the change in how HOA was being run under Karen's leadership. "Michael, I've heard about your situation," Mr. Henderson said, looking at me with understanding in his eyes. "You're not the only one she's made life difficult for. I've been asked to change fences, alter the plants, and there's never been a good reason for those requests. It's all because she wants to control everything." I nodded. Knowing Mr. Gore, Henderson understood the situation very well. This was why I needed his help, as well as the help of other residents. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Henderson. If you don't mind, I'd like you to share your story at this meeting. Your support will be invaluable in this fight." Mr. Henderson nodded, not saying anything further, but his gaze showed determination. More people began to arrive, and the conversation started to heat up. The residents in the area didn't just want to hear my story, but also wanted to share their own experiences with the HOA. A woman named Mary, who lived not far from my house, stood up and began speaking. "I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've never seen a change as drastic as this. The HOA's demands have become excessive. Karen sent me letters asking me to do this and that, as if I were a lawbreaker. But when I asked about the regulations, they couldn't give me a reasonable answer. Everything was vague and unclear." Mary continued to tell how she was asked to change the wall dividing her house from the neighbors without any valid reason, simply because the HOA deemed it didn't meet the community standards. They never clarified the regulations, they just imposed their demands from above without consulting the residents. And I began to realize that this wasn't just about community management, it was a campaign to profit from their power. Mary's story not only highlighted the wrongdoings of the HOA, but it also reinforced my belief that I wasn't alone in this fight. The people in the room began looking at each other, realizing that it wasn't just me facing this injustice. Many others were also suffering from the decisions of the HOA, with no way to protest. The sense of unity began to spark. I then reinforced the purpose of the meeting. We're not just standing up to protect our own rights, but also to protect the rights of everyone who's been mistreated by the HOA. Those who have been pushed into difficult situations by Karen and the others in the HOA. They think we're weak and that we can't do anything. But I believe that if we fight together, we can change everything. My words were met with strong agreement from those around me. Nods of approval, quiet applause, all signs that the community was beginning to unite. By sharing our stories, We not only exposed Karen's schemes, but also proved that the HOA's opposition wasn't a personal issue, but a collective one affecting the entire community. After the meeting with Karen and the HOA, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Although I had made some progress in dealing with the HOA's manipulation, I knew this battle wasn't over. There was still much to uncover, and I couldn't rely solely on the documents I had. I needed to find the connections, the relationships between the HOA and local real estate developers, those who might be behind this entire plan. One late evening, as I was sitting in my office trying to organize the documents I had gathered, I stumbled upon an old contract in a file box my grandfather had stored. It was a contract between the HOA and a local real estate company, a company I had never heard of before. The contract discussed the development of land near my area, and what surprised me was that the terms in this contract seemed unclear. I felt something was very wrong. Why would a land development contract be signed without the involvement or discussion with landowners like myself? I couldn't let this slip by without further investigation. I needed more information, and I knew the person who could help me was Emily. I called Emily immediately. "Can you come over right now?" I asked as she answered the phone. "There's a very important document, and I need your help analyzing it." An hour later, Emily arrived at my house. She was patient and always had a sharp eye for detail. Together, we began reviewing the contract and other documents. After looking it over, Emily sighed and looked at me, her gaze full of doubt. "Michael, there's something fishy about this contract. Not only are the terms unclear, but the conditions regarding land zoning might be the key. If what we're seeing is true, then the HOA is orchestrating a big plan to profit from real estate development projects without being transparent with the community." "You're right," I replied, my heart sinking. Both the HOA and Karen may have teamed up with local developers to seize our land without informing us. This isn't just a small scam, it's a long-term strategy. But if that's the case, we need to prove this connection. Emily flipped through a few more pages of the documents, then pointed to a company name on one of the sheets. "This is the real estate company I've seen in the previous documents. This name appears multiple times in the HOA records. I think we need to dig deeper into this company." I nodded. "Then we need to dive into this. But we must be careful. A small mistake could make us lose this opportunity." We spent the whole night analyzing the documents, page by page, searching for connections and potential evidence. The tense conversations between Emily and me not only helped us identify crucial clues, but also strengthened my resolve. Things began to become clearer as I discovered that this real estate company not only had close ties with the HOA, but also had many connections with local government officials. This was the evidence I needed to bring the truth to light. "Michael, look at this." Emily pointed to a line on a document. "This is a copy of an official meeting they held with top local government officials. They're trying to use these relationships to influence land zoning decisions without informing the community." My heart raced. This was our opportunity. All these connections were the missing pieces to the puzzle. I knew I had uncovered a significant weakness in Karen and the HOA's plan. "We have to act quickly," I said, feeling the heat of the truth rising within me. "If everything we found is true, we'll have enough grounds to take them to court. What we need now is the community's unity and solid legal evidence." Emily and I continued to search for more evidence, and I began to build a new, stronger legal strategy based on what we had uncovered. This was a pivotal moment in my legal battle. I wasn't just fighting for my family anymore. I was fighting for the whole community, the people who had been manipulated by Karen and the HOA for so long. The confrontation between Karen Mitchell and me had now become inevitable. After days of collecting documents, analyzing evidence, and developing strategies, I was finally ready to face Karen and the HOA members in an official meeting. This wasn't just any regular meeting. It was my opportunity to prove that every action taken by Karen and the HOA was illegal and threatened the rights of my family and the people in this community. On that day, I walked into the meeting room with a strong yet calm feeling. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression no longer smug as it once was, though she still tried to maintain an air of authority. The HOA members sat silently, unwilling to meet my eyes. I could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation. "I think we've had quite a long meeting, and now it's time to wrap this up," Karen said, trying to maintain her confident tone. But I knew she was nervous, and the urgency in her voice indicated she realized she was being backed into a corner. "That's right," I replied, not missing the chance. "We'll wrap this up, but not the way you think." I placed a stack of documents in front of her, the ones that Emily and I had carefully organized. Each sheet was evidence of Karen and the HOA's manipulation. I didn't just have evidence about the land, but also a series of meetings and documents related to the covert relationships between the HOA and real estate developers that she had been involved with. Most notably, the contract I found between the HOA and a real estate company, one of the strongest pieces of evidence. "You can look through this and explain to me why there's a land development contract here without informing my family about any changes to the zoning?" I asked, my voice full of defiance yet firm. Karen quickly flipped through the documents, but the unease was evident on her face. "You don't understand the issue. This is a project that has been approved by the authorities," she tried to explain. "I understand it very well," I interrupted her. "This is not just a development project. This is an abuse of power to seize the property of residents without informing them. Don't think that your decisions can go unchallenged." Karen began to fumble, feeling defensive. "This is just a misunderstanding. The procedures were followed correctly. You don't have the right to stop us." "I don't need your permission," I responded sharply. "You may grant yourself power, but that power doesn't stand above the law. My family has owned this land for generations, and I won't let you continue to violate it." My words weren't just a condemnation of Karen's actions. They were a public declaration that I wouldn't back down. In the tense atmosphere, I saw some members of the HOA exchanging glances, as if they were starting to doubt the legality of the decisions Karen had made. A few of them began to realize that they couldn't continue standing by her. Karen could no longer maintain her smug confidence. "Mr. Adams," she said, her voice weakening, "we can't just keep going like this. This project is for the benefit of the community, not for your personal gain. If you don't agree, we'll have to proceed with the legal steps." "You can proceed any time you want," I replied, my voice resolute. "But you won't be able to do this without facing the consequences." A few seconds of silence passed before one of the board members spoke up. "Karen, we need to review everything carefully. It seems there are things we don't fully understand." This was the moment I had been waiting for. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, and I knew that the battle was no longer just between me and Karen. A small shift in the attitude of the HOA members, along with the documents I had provided, had started to shake Karen's control. After I discovered the important documents about the covert relationships between the HOA and real estate developers, I knew I had gathered enough evidence to expose the truth. The documents my grandfather left behind, along with the evidence Emily and I had collected, had created a powerful blow that Karen and the HOA couldn't continue to cover up their wrongdoings. Now I had to do one important thing: bring all this evidence to light. I decided to invite the residents of the area to a community meeting. I couldn't fight this battle alone, and I knew the community was the key to turning the tide. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, staring into the darkness, thinking about what was about to unfold. This was my opportunity to not only protect my family, but also to help everyone in the community understand the truth. When the meeting began, I was ready. Placing the documents and evidence on the table, I saw the skeptical looks from the crowd. A few people had already grown impatient and began speaking up. "Michael, is what you're saying really true?" someone from the community asked. "It turns out we've been manipulated all this time?" I nodded, not feeling worried. "Yes, that's the truth. HOA has used their power to seize our property without following any public process. What I'm showing you today will help you understand what's been going on." We began to share our stories. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, was the first to stand up. "Karen forced me to change the wall around my house just because she wanted it. I didn't get any reasonable explanation. It's all power manipulation. I see now I'm not the only one." Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. Their stories made it clearer than ever that not just my family, but many others in the area had suffered from the manipulation of HOA. A woman named Mary stood up and continued, "I've received letters asking me to change my fence with no clear reason. And when I asked them for information on the regulations, they would avoid answering. When I asked about the HOA's development project, they never gave me a clear response." At that moment, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The hesitation and silence were gone. People began to speak up, and the outrage in the community was spreading. We had been pushed to the wall, and now it was time for us to stand up and protect our rights. I turned to look at everyone, feeling the strength of unity growing. What we're doing here is not just for my family, but for everyone who has been mistreated by the HOA. If we don't stand up now, no one will protect us anymore. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The residents began to realize that they were no longer the weak side in this fight. We had found strength in our unity, and now we had enough evidence and determination to expose the wrongdoings of Karen and the HOA. After the meeting, I started sharing the documents on social media, and soon our story spread throughout the community. The accusations about HOA's power manipulation and Karen's actions became louder, sparking a wave of outrage. People began to recognize the truth, and the anger spread like wildfire. Karen, who had always considered herself to have absolute power in the community, could no longer maintain her confidence. She began to realize that this time, she couldn't control everything like before. The HOA members started exchanging worried glances. Phone calls from the authorities and real estate developers she had ties with started becoming more tense. Especially when the accusations about shady dealings were made public, Karen's anxiety began to show. With every phone call and meeting, I could clearly feel her losing control. Once again, I proved that nothing could stop the truth. I wasn't just fighting for my family, I was fighting for fairness and transparency, which the community deserved. Karen and the HOA couldn't maintain their grip on power, and I wouldn't stop until everything was made clear. After uncovering the hidden secrets of the HOA and Karen, I knew it was time to take this fight to the next level. I had gathered enough evidence, documents, meetings, and community support to prove that every decision Karen and the HOA had made was illegal. I finally decided to take the case to court. This would be the final legal battle, where everything I had worked for would be proven in front of the law. Emily, my lawyer, and the community worked together to develop a detailed plan for this fight. She had been with me throughout this journey, and I knew her support would be decisive in this legal battle. She had studied every document, every meeting I had recorded, and prepared the defenses to protect the rights of my family and the residents in the area. The day of the final trial arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air. I walked into the courtroom, where many residents from the area had come to support me. The community stood by my side, fighting against the injustice they had endured for so many years. The residents who had been mistreated by the HOA, from fence alterations to unreasonable demands, now stood united with me, ready to testify in this court. The courtroom witnessed a fiery battle between the prosecution and the defense. Karen sat across from me, still trying to maintain her confidence, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes. Although she tried to deny everything and blame me and the community, Emily and I had prepared far too thoroughly. Every document, every story from the community, every piece of evidence I brought was a powerful blow to Karen and her team's arguments. "We're not just fighting for the rights of my family," I began in the courtroom, "but for the fairness of the entire community. Karen and the HOA have manipulated power to profit from decisions that were not transparent or publicly disclosed. Their actions are an abuse of power, and it needs to stop today." Emily stood beside me, strong and confident, continuing to present strong evidence of the HOA's illegal decisions regarding the residents. She pointed out that no official meetings had been held to inform the community about development projects, and all zoning changes had been made without the consent of the residents. Karen, trying to maintain her smug attitude, could not deny the evidence Emily and I had presented. "Mr. Adams doesn't understand the issue," Karen said, attempting to downplay everything. "We followed all the proper procedures, and this project is for the benefit of the community." But her words no longer held weight. The community members began speaking up in the courtroom, recounting their painful experiences with the HOA. The room fell silent as each person stood up to share their story of how they were forced to make changes and penalized for unreasonable actions. These people weren't just witnesses. They were individuals who had lived with the injustice and abuse of power from the HOA for years. At that moment, I felt the power of unity within the community growing stronger. The testimonies from the residents not only reinforced the evidence I had presented, but also showed the determination of all of us to push back against the abuse of power. We stood up not only for our own families, but for everyone who had ever been made to suffer under the HOA. After months of perseverance and relentless fighting, we finally won the legal battle. When the court declared that the HOA and Karen had violated the law in their land grab and abuse of power, I felt an enormous weight lifted from my shoulders. This verdict wasn't just a victory for my family, but for all those who had suffered from the injustice of the HOA. Karen, once the symbol of arrogance and manipulation, had finally faced the consequences of her wrongful actions. The documents and evidence I had gathered, along with the unwavering support from the community, had rendered her incapable of defending her actions. The key members of the HOA, those who had been complicit with Karen all along, also had to take responsibility and face the legal repercussions. The court decided to halt all illegal development projects the HOA had carried out, including the hotel project on my family's land. The land ownership rights of my family and the surrounding residents were restored, and the plans Karen and the HOA had laid out to seize our properties were completely nullified. This was a moment where I felt like I had completed my mission, but I also realized that this victory was not just mine or my family's. It was for all the residents in this community. The people in the community, those who had stood by me and shared their stories, began to feel the change. Their land, the properties they once feared would be stolen, were now legally protected. The residents no longer had to live in fear of the unreasonable demands from the HOA. They started to look at each other with new eyes, no longer as oppressed individuals, but as winners in the battle against injustice. The feeling I had when I saw the community starting to change was indescribable. The fences, the absurd regulations, and the pressures the HOA had created over the years were no longer there. People began talking to one another, sharing stories about the change and the hope for the future. I knew that, though the battle wasn't fully over, this victory had created a major turning point, not just for my family, but for all those who had been made to suffer under the HOA's abuse of power. The community had regained its legal rights, and we began to feel the freedom and fairness that had been denied to us for so long. Michael not only protected his family, but also sparked a wave of justice for those who had been wronged by the HOA in the past. The struggles were never easy, but the final outcome showed that persistence and courage can defeat the abuse of power. "This isn't just my victory," I said in a community meeting after the court ruling. "This is our victory. If we hadn't stood up, if we hadn't come together, justice would have never won. Each of us has the right to be protected, and no one can take that away." The community clapped, and our unity was affirmed in that moment. Everyone understood that, even though the battle was over, what we had started would never be extinguished. Michael's struggle had become a symbol of perseverance, courage, and the determination to fight for justice in the community. I felt proud that I never gave up, and I knew that this community would never again allow those in power to harm us. As everything settled down, I stood on my family's land, gazing at the vast fields that still greeted the morning light. We had won, but this victory was not just for my family. It was a victory for everyone who had endured the abuse of power, for the community I had helped build from the very beginning. I hadn't just protected this land, but I had also safeguarded the values we had upheld for generations. Seeing the residents of the area now living in freedom and fairness, I knew I had done the right thing. Those who had once been controlled by the HOA were now free to make their own decisions, no longer fearing unreasonable demands. HOA meetings were no longer a place where Karen and her accomplices manipulated everything. They had become a place where the community could come together to make decisions, building the area with transparency and trust. As I walked into my home, where everything had begun, I felt a sense of pride, not just for my family, but for all the people who fought alongside me. I had not stood alone in this battle. The community had stood by me, bravely facing their fears, and together we made a change. All the people in this area had made me realize that the strength of unity is unbreakable. "We've won, Michael," Emily said, standing beside me, her smile full of pride. "But this victory isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new era for our community. What we've done will forever be a lesson for future generations." I nodded, unable to say more. This was when I felt most the power of persistence. It wasn't an easy fight, and I had sacrificed a lot. But a fight for justice is always worth it. I never gave up, and now everything we did had brought the results we deserved. Looking at this area, I could clearly see that justice doesn't just come from court decisions or the law. It comes from the determination of those who stand up to protect what is right. And if we hold on to our beliefs and never accept injustice, we will always find a way to win. Finally, I turned back to look at my family's land, the place where I and the generations before me had worked hard. It was not just land. It was proof of the power of persistence and courage. It was a reminder to me that no matter how powerful the forces we face, if we unite, protect justice, and never give up, we will always prevail.